All right. To quote one of my favorite authors, Simon Sinek, he has a book called Start With Why. So why are we all here today? There are a lot of recent events in the EMS world that have required all of us to look hard and deep into the services we provide our communities. In this kind of reflection, AFR has appreciated a potential gap in the services that we provide and deliver, particularly in the medical, legal, and documentation world. We've reached out to the law firm of Page, Wolfberg & Worth for some guidance. Page, Wolfberg & Worth is the nation's leading EMS law firm. They're a next-generation national EMS and mobile healthcare consulting firm. These guys are the experts. Joining us today from PWW is EMS mobile healthcare consultant, EMS attorney, and co-founder of PWW, Doug Wolfberg. Doug is a former EMS provider, former county EMS director, former statewide EMS official, former federal EMS leader. He brings to today's lecture over 45 years in EMS. With Doug is Dr. Shannon Golnick. Dr. Golnick is an EMS mobile healthcare consultant, a current EMS provider, a former fire medic, an IAF rep, an ECFD certified flight medic with a doctorate in business administration. He has over 27 years in EMS. Like I said, these guys are the experts. So without further, I'd like you guys to give a very warm welcome to both Doug Wolfberg and Shannon Golnick.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Doug Wolfberg. I'm a lawyer, and I'm here to help you. This is Dr. Shannon Golnick. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. We are going to be tag teaming back and forth the presentation over the next few hours. We will take a break about halfway through. Brain can only absorb what the butt can endure, so we promise to give you a break. So we're really just going to go ahead and jump into it and give you a little overview of what we're going to talk about, and then just get into it. And I want to thank Commander Hayes for the wonderful introduction, and for AFR for having us here. I know most of you here with AFR. We have some folks from Falk and also some neighboring agencies. So we appreciate everybody coming here, and we appreciate the invitation to be here. And we also have Medical Director Dr. Eric Hill with us today as well. So you may hear some interaction with all of us weighing in on some of these issues. So we call this a documentation skills workshop. And as we'll talk about, we are such a skill-centric profession with whether it's learning to start an IV or intubate or whatever it is. Documentation is also a skill. It's something we can learn, practice, improve, right? We all have the capacity to be outstanding documenters in every interaction that we have. And that's really the goal. So we have to also give you the disclaimer that even though I'm a lawyer, this is not legal advice. This is an educational session. We have already been duly introduced. The most important part of our introductions is that we both have been active in the EMS field as providers, as well as in our other roles as consultants, and in my case, also an attorney. So you heard Commander Hayes say that we have both been in EMS a while. I'm not saying we're old, but we did find pictures of our first ambulance calls. That one is Shannon, and that one is me. So we did find these old pictures. We thought we'd like to share those with you. And you also heard a little bit about our firm. So we just do EMS. That is our only practice area. That makes us legitimate ambulance chasers. That joke almost writes itself if you're a lawyer, by the way. So all we do is EMS law and consulting through our two entities. So here is what we're going to talk about. In the interest of time, instead of reading you all the bullet points of what we're going to talk about, let's just go ahead and start talking about it, all right? The first thing is an overview of EMS documentation. So some of this stuff is very basic, introductory, frame the topic. And then we're going to get into some things that I think will spur some more interest, questions, dialogue perhaps. We're going to move through that as quickly as we can, and we will certainly be available for, if we get into some extended dialogue on some of the issues, as we did in this morning's session, we may just defer that till after the session, and then we can have a little bit more in-depth conversation about that. So, as I said, documentation is a skill, and that is why we are here. We also would be remiss if we didn't sort of also on a high level remember to frame the issue as an ethical one. So we're going to talk a lot about legal issues and principles of documentation, how that interacts with legal responsibilities and all of those things. But ethically, as caregivers, as clinicians, and I know historically our profession hasn't thought of ourselves in that way. We think of ourselves as public safety in many respects. We are clinicians, EMS caregivers, and we have an ethical responsibility in how we care for patients and to accurately document the care that we provide to them. These are medical records, but they are also legal records, as we know. Now, we call PCRs patient care reports because they are fundamentally patient care documents. And documentation is a fundamental part of patient care. Our first job is clinical, but that PCR is an integral part of the care process, right? It does become part of the patient's medical record, and it is an integral part of patient care. The continuity of care, the handoff of care. You know, we get to the ER, then 2 or 3 hours later they take over. Sorry, just can't resist that one, right? So we have some core responsibilities to document completely, making sure that all the relevant information is captured operationally, clinically, right? We get necessary signatures on all the different forms that need them. We document accurately. We're honest in all aspects of documentation, dosages, measurements, vital signs, whatever those are. We do not purposefully omit things, even if they may tend to look bad. Because it is always harder to explain an omission that is purposeful than to address it head on, right? So that's another important, no purposeful omission of facts, right? And no documentation of something that isn't a fact. So that works on both sides of the coin. And we certainly do not misrepresent for improper purposes like CYA or avoiding liability, right? I mean, if something goes bad, again, it is harder to explain why that was absent in the documentation than in some cases to explain the conduct itself. You've heard the cover-up's worse than the crime, right? So, though I'm not saying cover-up, I'm saying that an omission can be seen as something that needs to be explained. And sometimes it is better to address things head on. To document timely. The closer in time that a PCR is completed to the time of the call and the time of the care, it is more reliable, it's more accurate, it's a better representation of what happened. And when time, right, is between the incident and our documentation, that can be seen as less reliable and more suspect or questionable, certainly in a court environment. We have privacy issues to remember. Luckily for you, we are not going to make your eyes glaze over and your ears bleed by talking about HIPAA. But we have to remember that the information, although the charts belong to the department or to your agency, the information on them belongs to the patient. And we are not free to share that except for treatment or certain limited operational purposes, right? So we secure those records. We do not, post things on social media. Just as we couldn't print a PCR and hand it to a neighbor and go, look at this guy down the street did. We can't verbally share that information either, right? So it's the information contained on that PCR as well as the PCR itself. We can't snoop through somebody's records because we heard a friend or neighbor got transported or called 911, right, if we weren't involved in that care. And I already mentioned social media, as you see here. We can use documentation for proper purposes, such as post, right, retrospective chart review, QA, QI, improvement of care in the future, right? But all of that has to be done for those proper purposes and only as the law permits. Okay, let's talk about, we're using the term EMS documentation very generally, but what are we talking about when we say EMS documentation? Certainly the PCR, which we'll spend most of our time talking about. There's signature forms that the patient or others may sign. There's NIFRS reports, which we'll talk about a little bit before we're done. There may be separate incident reports. On the transport side, especially non-emergencies, and maybe like certifications of medical necessity. And documentation we may gather from other sources and providers, right? Pick up a patient at a SNF, for example. They may send medical records. Now, back to the PCR, it's going to have multiple components, as we know. Demographics, information about the patient, operational section, times, for example, locations, our data fields, and our clinical narrative. And we are going to spend a lot of time talking about clinical narrative strategies, how to make those more robust, how to better communicate the clinical information, while also, the bonus is reducing our liability, and how data fields and narratives work together and don't replace each other. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So data fields, as I just said, don't replace the narrative. And as you know, those of us who are dinosaurs that have been around for a while have gone from paper PCRs to electronic PCRs, the question always comes up, well, if we're checking all these boxes and entering all these data fields, what's left for the narrative? And we're going to spend some time talking about that. They both have to be complete and accurate, but they both serve distinct purposes, right? So the checkboxes and the pick lists and the data fields collect data. The narrative tells a story. And that's what we're going to spend a lot of our time focusing on, okay? So for example, and there are certain things that data fields cannot do. So if I have a data field that has the three components of the GCS, and I score the patient as a 2 to eyes, a 3 to verbal, and a 4 to motor, they are a 9 on the GCS. If my narrative says patient is alert and oriented times 4, that is a fundamental inconsistency because you don't get to be both of those things. Okay, so we also have to make sure that these sections work in tandem and that they are clinically consistent. All right, let's visit on some different purposes that one single PCR meets, fulfills all these other purposes. So you see them listed here. I'm going to just do them one at a time. We already talked about a PCR as a patient care report, so it is first and foremost a clinical record. It becomes part of the patient's medical chart. It is relied upon by other providers in transfer of care situations. So it is first and foremost a clinical record of that patient's care. We use it for QA, QI, improving care that we render to patients in the future. We use it to collect data, as we talked about the data fields. I'm sure we have all heard the term NEMSIS. And we all love NEMSIS and their data fields, right? Some people say it should be called Nemesis, but they are not. They're not our enemy. The NEMSIS, National EMS Information System, we collect and report data that gets used at local, regional, state, and federal levels to help improve public health, EMS access, and all kinds of other things. It's used for compliance, and it is also a legal record. So what was done? What wasn't done? Why was it done? Why wasn't it done? Right? All of those things can be, PCR can be used to help answer those questions in legal cases. And there are lots of kinds of legal cases in which a PCR can be used. A medical malpractice case, alleging a breach of the standard of care, perhaps against EMS, perhaps against other providers. Could be a personal injury case. Driver runs a red light, T-bones the vehicle in the intersection. Driver A sues driver B. Your chart is merely evidence in their case. Disciplinary cases against EMS providers by the state EMS office, for example, right? In some quality of care cases, that may become an issue. And in criminal cases, of course, not just the one that made such news out here, but most often it's the patient involved in criminal conduct. Maybe they were assaulted by a person, and that chart could be used as evidence in the case against the perpetrator. Maybe the person was involved in committing a crime themselves and were being treated, right? So most often, the overwhelming majority of cases that are criminal in nature, that's how a PCR is used in evidence. So it's a good, idea to write every PCR as if it could end up in court. And in a legal proceeding, no matter what type it is, the question that is ultimately being answered in a court proceeding or in a legal proceeding is, did this care meet the standard of care? And we're going to visit this word a few times, but the standard of care is ultimately what was, somebody give me the word. Give me the word. What word are we judged by? Perfection? What is it? We have to act reasonably, prudently, right? So the stuff we learned back in the legal section of the EMT basic class is all true. Negligence is based on whether the provider acted reasonably under the circumstances. And we're going to come back and visit that term a few times as we go through some of this today. What did you do? Why did you do it? What didn't you do? Why didn't you do it? Right? Those are the foundational questions that a PCR really needs to address. We have our legal responsibilities to complete PCRs and report appropriately, etc. So now we're going to shift into clinical narratives, but let me first ask, does anyone have any questions or comments on anything we have said thus far? Hearing none. More death by PowerPoint. Let's talk about clinical narratives. A narrative, folks, is a story, right? It is a first-person account of a particular patient interaction that we write in a chronological sequence to tell the story of the call. And that's really all a narrative is, okay? Now, it allows us to do things that data fields can't do. It allows us, for example, to describe complex and sometimes contradictory facts in a way that can be easily understood. So if I respond to a call for reported chest pain, and I get there and there's a 65-year-old man going, I don't have any chest pain, you're crazy, I'm fine. Spouse takes you aside and goes, he's been complaining of chest pain all morning, right? If I check the box that says chest pain as a chief complaint, that's not going to really synthesize those inconsistent facts. Patient denies chest pain, but patient's spouse reported that the patient complained of severe chest pain approximately 30 minutes prior to our arrival. Chest pain as a drop-down menu doesn't tell us those things. So the narrative tells that complete story of the call in a chronological sequence. And in a little bit, Shannon is going to talk about a chart writing format to help you chronologically organize those narratives. That narrative should be done primarily by the clinical provider who was in charge of the patient's care. That should typically be who writes that PCR, that narrative. Now, a good narrative should do and should not do certain things, and we're going to spend a minute talking about that. And although we talk about a narrative telling a story, I want to first plant the seed that it should be thought of as a visual exercise. It should paint a picture, right? Like we think of it as that visual exercise. So the crew is there, the patient's there, some bystanders are there. Everyone else who reads that chart wasn't there. Can they pick it up, read it, and visualize what that scene was all about, right? That's the visualization test. Is this the elderly female seated in a recliner in no apparent distress? Or is this two placarded tanker trucks on the interstate with a cloud of methyl ethyl bad shit wafting over the scene, right? So we paint that picture, that visual exercise. Next time someone tells me my narrative should paint a picture, there you go, right? What's that guy's name? I can't remember. Yes. Good narrative should be an accurate and complete record of the patient's condition and the care provided. And as we said earlier, it has clinical, legal, operational, etc. significance. Now, a good narrative should not be an incident report. It's not a document to point fingers or lay blame at other responders or other providers or other agencies, or things that are operational but not germane to the call. We were back in the unit in after the call and we knocked off the mirror. Okay, whatever, right? Not part of the PCR. The first responders who got there before we did totally screwed up, stabilization of the patient's C-spine, whatever it is, right? So that's not the place to sort of point fingers. It looks defensive. It looks like a deflection. It can hamper a defense in a joint liability case where there's multiple defendants and they're all pointing fingers at each other, right? So those documents are not the place to lay blame or assign responsibility. All right, we shouldn't purposefully omit information. I know we have some folks from transporting agencies here, particularly when we talk about billing, medical necessity. Well, the patient walked from the bed to the stretcher. If we write that down, we might not be able to get paid. If that's a fact of what happened, it gets documented. We don't purposefully omit, right? Okay, So let's visit, any questions, comments, anything before we move on to the next issue, which is the question of double documentation. So as EPCR data fields get more robust, and we can document 90% of what there is in data sections, to what extent do I have to write down things in the narrative section that were already documented in the data fields? All right, so let's visit that issue for a few minutes. And our answer is, if the data field communicates a complete fact for which no additional context is needed, it does not need to be repeated in the narrative. But on the other hand, if additional context is needed, it should be discussed in the narrative. So let's say, for example, we have a data field that contains vital signs. And in 1647, pressure was 140/96, pulse was 92, respirations were 24. I don't know about you guys and gals, but I purposely do not see the need for a sentence in a narrative that says, at 1647, the blood pressure was, right? It's simply repetitive. It doesn't add anything to the discussion. But if I want to expand on observations or context, such as the radial pulse was bounding and irregular, respirations were shallow and labored, right? A narrative can be a place where you do that. Now, we already visited chest pain, but I could have 5 patients in one shift who all have chest pain as a chief complaint. And each one of them could perceive that pain entirely differently. And pain is one of the most common complaints in the pre-hospital setting. That screams out for more context. And Shannon's going to talk a little bit more about pain documentation a little bit later. But if I check chest pain as a chief complaint, I need to fill in the details, right? Patient states the pain is located in the center of the chest, slightly to left. Describes the pain as sharp and stabbing. Pain radiates to the lower jaw and down the left arm, right? And we'll get into the use of descriptive words in a few minutes as well. So what I'm going to do now is talk about 7 core principles of good clinical narrative writing. Then I'm going to hand it over to Shannon to talk about the chronological documentation format. So the first one of these core principles is to be complete. Capturing all relevant information, not purposefully omitting any relevant information, and capturing all the aspects of the operations, assessment, treatment, transport, disposition of the patient. Complete also means we do not traffic in assumptions in our documentation. If it's something we always do, it is dangerous to simply say, well, I always do that, so I didn't write it down. If it's something we always do, it should be something we always document. So if I intubate a patient and it is standard to verify tube placement, either with end tidal CO2 or listening to breath sounds or all of the above, this should be said, right? This brings it, whoa, that happened fast. Let's go back here to our first case study, which is documentation and not assumptions. This was an actual case, came up in Illinois. An ALS ambulance was dispatched to a Chinese restaurant for a case of severe respiratory distress. Patient's husband reported that the patient must have come into contact with food that was prepared with peanut products, and she was allergic to peanuts. Patient is found in severe respiratory distress. By the time the patient is loaded into the ambulance, she is not effectively breathing on her own. Crew intubates, they transport. ER physician determines that the patient was esophageally intubated instead of tracheally intubated, reintubates the patient, but the patient dies. 1 year later, the family files a lawsuit for wrongful death, alleging negligent care. The PCR did not document any steps that were taken post-intubation to verify proper placement of the tube. The medic even testified in the deposition saying, well, it's just accepted, it's assumed. I don't write it down because it's standard procedure. Citing in part that testimony, the insurance company settled the case for $1.5 million, right? Just for simply omitting a fact which was considered to be routine. Now, documentation also means documenting pertinent negatives. But what is pertinent is always situational. It's always going to depend on the patient's chief complaint. If I have a 20-year-old otherwise healthy patient who twists their ankle rounding the base in a softball game, patient denies chest pain is quite likely not a pertinent negative. But if the patient's chief complaint is shortness of breath, chest pain is very much a pertinent negative. Okay? Being complete also means telling the full story of the encounter, including a visual description of that initial encounter. So, for example, if I simply state patient was found supine in bed, that is not a particularly revealing statement. Because if you come to my house early enough on any given day, that is where and how you will find me. Doesn't mean I am in urgent need of health care, right? So we can fill that out with our powers of observation. Patient was found in a hospital bed in the bedroom, supine, 30 degrees upright, calmly speaking to his son, pale skin, but otherwise no obvious distress. Well, we already know this is a person that's sick enough to have a hospital bed at home, right? We're using our observational powers to fill out that detail. May seem mundane or trivial, but it demonstrates significant attention to that proper detail. Okay, next thing. In the whole scheme of what's really important and what's less important, I classify this as more important, right? And that is to ensure that our documentation is objective and not subjective. Objective means we're dealing in facts and that it is unbiased. Subjective means we're dealing either with opinions or conclusions that lack any supporting facts. I'm going to give you an example. Patient appears to be intoxicated at the present time. Oh, we dressed it up a little bit with terminology. Intoxicated, present time. That's nothing more than my opinion based on observations that I didn't bother to detail. By the way, that is every patient care report I wrote between 1983 and 1987, working EMS at Penn State University. Okay, but that's beside the point. On the other side of the coin, if we say, patient has noticeable odor of alcoholic beverages on breath, patient's eyes are bloodshot, speech is slurred, patient admits drinking 6 beers in the past 30 minutes. Nowhere do we use the word or the conclusion intoxicated. But listed there are facts which lead the reader very much to that conclusion. So instead of blurting out a conclusion that has no factual support, I have listed the facts. And then people can draw the conclusion pretty readily, right? Now, patients may report information that is subjective. And I know in the SOAP chart format, we'll talk about a little bit later, subjective, objective, assessment plan, we treat patient reports as subjective. I don't know, folks, but I tend to think of that as a slightly different animal. If a patient said it and I heard it, I feel like reporting what the patient told me is highly objective. It makes me a good documenter of what was said. I think that's fact-based. That's objective. The patient's report is subjective. Feels like an elephant sitting on my chest. Yes, that is subjective, but when they said it and I heard it, it became a fact of how they described their pain, right? Another great way to improve the objectivity of your documentation is to be both qualitative and quantitative. Quantitative refers to quantities, numbers. Qualitative are fact-based descriptive terms. So in this 2-sentence part of a narrative, patient describes the pain as sharp and stabbing, rates the pain an 8 on a 1 to 10 scale. We have both qualitative, the fact-based descriptive terms, sharp, stabbing, right? And descriptive terms can really make your charts more objective. Sharp, stabbing, dull, aching, burning, tearing, right? Those descriptors. And then when we ask the patient to rate their pain on a 1 to 10 scale, we quantify it. Now, folks, let's be real here. Asking a patient, how bad does it hurt on a 1 to 10 scale, and they give us a number, is that subjective? Yes. But when we quantify it, the pain scale is to help make those subjective reports more objective. And by the way, if you have a male patient who says it's an 8 on a 1 to 10 scale, the same injury would be a 2 to a female patient because men are sissies, right? Women are tough. So it is inherently subjective, but we quantify it to help make the documentation more objective, okay? All right, next principle, specificity. First, any questions, comments? Yes?
Where is the line between the paramedic in Illinois? Could you be criminally charged for esophagally intubating someone? Where's the line?
If they were conscious, alert, and oriented times 4, I'd say that'd be a bad choice.
Well, in that exact situation where the patient needs respiratory support.
Yeah, so the question was, can you be criminally charged for esophageally intubating somebody if you improperly intubated? I think if there was any evidence you did it intentionally, yes. I think otherwise, I've never seen such a case and can't imagine any facts under which an improper administration of a medical intervention, let's say that was an appropriate medical intervention, patient needed intubated but you did it incorrectly. I mean, that is strictly medical malpractice and negligence. I personally, in my years of experience as an attorney and as a provider, have never seen a case of a criminal charge for improper execution of a skill that was necessary by the patient's condition. Okay, next core principle here, specificity. Specificity, I think of in two terms, geographic and anatomic. Where in the world and where on the patient, right? So geographically, where are we? Are we at patient's home, somebody else's residence? Are we at work? Are we at school? Are we at an intersection? Are we in a public place? So if I start out a narrative and say patient fell from standing position, which is the beginning of a good mechanism of injury documentation, but I note while entering a grocery store, patient reported she tripped on a rubber mat that was not taped down and was sticking up in one end. Not only does that give me better information about the mechanism of injury, but when it comes time to pay for these healthcare services, who's probably going to be the first phone that rings to pay the bill? The grocery store, their liability carrier, right? So by being more complete, we can help make sure that this not only care is navigated, but in some cases, financial responsibility. Anatomic specificity. All those terms that we learned in the first couple of weeks of EMT basic class, right? In the terminology part, where we're all zoning out, waiting to get, what week is trauma again, right? The terms like distal, proximal, anterior, superior, right? Those terms are how we anatomically landmark the site of injury or a complaint when it comes to patient care, right? So it's not terribly specific to say I have a patient who complains of abdominal pain since 0800. Because pain, as we said, is a very vague, general, non-specific complaint. On the other hand, if I say I have a patient who complains of abdominal pain since 0800, patient says the pain is in the right lower quadrant, is sharp in nature, radiates to all other quadrants. First it was intermittent, then became constant, describes the pain as 10 on a 1 to 10 scale. Abdomen is extremely tender, even to minor touching. Right? So on the left, I don't know, this doesn't seem like much of anything. It could describe anyone who's eaten at a Taco Bell in the prior 48 hours. On the right, we may have a patient with a hot abdomen, right? A true clinical emergency. So the difference in the kind of specificity makes all the difference in the world from a clinical documentation standpoint. Another good way to be specific is to avoid vagueness in words and phrases. So for example, patient complains of weakness. Okay, that's a start, but the point is on those vague terms, like pain, like weakness, that are non-specific, we need more context. So for example, with pain, Shannon will talk more about OPQRST. But with terms like weakness, my next question when I read a chart that says that is what are the clinical manifestations of that weakness? Can they hold a pen? What's their grip strength? Can they stand unassisted? Can they ambulate to the cot? Can they support their weight when seated? Right? Tell me the next thing. What are the clinical manifestations of that weakness? All right, the next of our core principles is that our PCR narratives need to be what we call dispassionate, meaning that they are unbiased, they are rational, they are non-judgmental, right? They're impartial. The example you see here is none of those things, right? Dispatch 911, shortness of breath, 0300, patient was shuffling around kitchen with no complaints. Patient did not need an ambulance, no way, no how. This was a waste of my time. All of us, ladies and gentlemen, have thought this. When it bubbles into our PCR, that is a different story entirely. Okay? So we do not let it be clouded by our own bias or judgment or emotions or that sort of thing. Next core principle is that our PCR narrative should be professional in terms of terminology, spell checking, within our scope of practice. We use clinically appropriate abbreviations, etc. Back to terminology. Patient has a possible broken leg, says the 10-year-old on the playground, right? As healthcare providers, we communicate in clinical terms. Patient has a possible fracture of right distal tib fib, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? That's how healthcare providers communicate in that language. We use vivid, descriptive words. That is the next core principle, to be descriptive. We already rattled off a few, right? When we ask a patient to describe their pain. Sharp, dull, aching, burning, is it centrally located? Does it radiate, right? Be descriptive. Patient has an altered mental status. Compare that to patient was extremely drowsy and lethargic, could be aroused only by shouting loud verbal commands. You see more words that sort of leap off the page to describe that scene, paint that picture. And then finally, a PCR narrative should be organized chronologically. It flows in a format that is easy to follow. That is how our brain processes stories. We are genetically wired to go from once upon a time to happily ever after, right? So Shannon's going to talk a lot about a chart writing format for that very purpose, okay? Now, before he does that, the format that he's going to present is called DRAT, which we all know SOAP, we all know chart, right? Chart, chief complaint, history, assessment, treatment, RX, and transport. SOAP, subjective, objective assessment plan. DRAT is EMS specific and chronologically based, and Shannon's going to walk you through that. But again, while none of these are mandatory, the idea is to organize your narrative in a consistent format that serves you well, that is a trigger for you to remember the things that need to be addressed on a good, flowing, chronological-based narrative. So what he's going to present is food for thought on one of those approaches. Sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for coming this afternoon. For those that just watched me chug a 5-hour, I am a medic, so caffeine is one of the 4 food groups. You guys have all heard of SOAP. You've heard of chart. How many of you in this room are good medics? Average, mediocre medics. Really? Halfway decent medics? All right. How many of you want to be good medics, right? Everybody wants to be a good medic. How are you judged on your clinical ability? How are we judged as EMS providers on how good we are? The EPCR is not just an EPCR for the patient. It is also an opportunity for us to tell a story. Because unfortunately, or the good part about EMS is that we only have our partner with us most of the time. The bad part is only our partner gets to see the things that we do, right? So how do we express to the rest of the world how good we are? Well, the same way that the rest of the world is going to judge us based on the story that we tell, based on the EPCR, right? So the idea behind DRAT is it's a narrative format. It was developed by Page, Wolfberg, and Worth. It is very EMS specific, it is chronological, and it is actually embedded in some of the EPCR software. So what does it stand for? Dispatch, response, arrival, assessment, treatment, and transport. Exactly how you run the call. And the idea behind this whole premise of skill building is we practice documentation every single day. Every single day we come to work, it is a skill that we use, but we don't train on it. And that's the challenge that we have. We have intubations. We maybe intubate 3, 4 patients a year, maybe, if we're lucky. Tons of training on it, but not so much on the documentation side of it. So we'll start with dispatch. How it all started. Once upon a time, right? Narrative should begin with the patient's reported condition and how the information that was conveyed to you, right? Doesn't matter if it's actually true, doesn't matter if it turns out to be completely 100% false. How were you dispatched? And why does this matter? It matters because it starts the process of your storytelling. You were called for chest pain. When you got there, the patient was having back pain. When you got there, the patient wasn't having pain at all. When you got there, the patient just wanted to arrive at the hospital, was standing with Samsonites, standing next to him on the curb, ready to go to the hospital because it was turkey sandwich day. Doesn't matter. How you start the story is very important because it lets the reader know, the quality assurance person know, the attorneys know how you were dispatched. Time of dispatch, time you were on scene, precise location of the call, right? Zip code if you can get it. Exact nature of the dispatch. You guys have Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, right? Good stuff. And your response determinants, which are issued by the dispatcher. This starts your storytelling. What you find on scene doesn't matter, right? That's the next step of the process. But it's important because from a legal standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, what the patient described or what the third-party caller said in the beginning was very important to how many resources were sent, when you were sent, and how long it took you to get there, right? So your response. What's an emergency? I don't know, right? It's subjective. Document the response mode in real life words, not emergency, but lights and sirens. You remember, people that are going to be reading your story may not be clinicians, right? Responded, lights and sirens, or no lights and sirens, or low priority. Use plain English. Code 3s, all those good stuff, all out the door. We're done with those. Be specific, right? We were dispatched for chest pain. We responded immediately to the scene, lights and sirens. It's not hard. And when we talk about telling a story, the story doesn't have to be, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It doesn't have to be War and Peace. You can communicate a lot of information in very few words. If you do it in a pattern, if you do it consistently, and you do it with the intent to convey your story. So arrival, right? You got dispatched to the call. Once upon a time, there was a blah, blah, blah. Now you get to the scene. What do you see? Your scene size up. This is basic EMS stuff. What do I see? Car accident. Am I looking at a house filled with hoarder material? Am I looking at just a crime scene? What am I looking at? What you encountered, what you see, and the overall appearance of the scene. What do you see here? A good Saturday night. What do you see here? It's okay, it's interactive. You gotta
30-year-old male,
30-year-old male.
semi-conscious.
Semi-conscious. Ravens fan. Too soon? That's too soon. That's probably too soon. All right. Yeah. He looks, what? Intoxicated, drunk, passed out, right? All subjective, right? Because we don't know. What you see is a 25-year-old man, so who said 30-ish? All right, close enough. Found seated at a bar with his head resting in his forearms, eyes closed, right? Paint me a story. Tell me what you see objectively, not what you assume. Let the reader of the story make the assumptions, because all you're providing is objective facts that you see, because you're telling the story about what you found. How the reader interprets it, it's up to them. Give them the tools to interpret it correctly, but let them come to that conclusion. What about this one? What do you see? What's that? Palliative care. Maybe. Is he in bed? Yeah? I think that's a he. It's a hippie. 70-year-old male found in hospital bed in front of in the family room. Patient was supine in bed, elevated 30 degrees upright, covered in a blanket with a nasal cannula in place, blah, 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 blah. That short documentation tells a story filled with information, right? They're in a hospital bed. All right, well, there's obviously some mobility issues you can draw from that information. Elevated upright, covered with a blanket, nasal cannula in place. All right, well, there's obviously some medical history there that requires the need of supplemental oxygen. Skin was pale, patient was to be in no respiratory or other distress. Okay, right? Now I've got a patient, elderly, oxygen. Patient was calmly speaking to a middle-aged male. They're alert, they're conscious, they're talking. That information that you told in that story speaks volumes to what you saw and what you found in the assessment. Key component of good clinical narrative, the story that you tell has to be a good story because the reader is going to judge you on that story. If you have left out details, missed information, what kind of care did you provide? Crappy, right? Did you really? I don't know. I wasn't there. But what's documented, poor documentation means poor patient care because you didn't tell the story. You didn't communicate the level of care that you provided. And that's the conclusion that the reader is going to draw. That's the conclusion that QA and QI is going to draw. And that's the conclusion that the attorneys are going to draw. Incomplete documentation means incomplete care, right? Was this a trauma or a medical call? Did you see any life threats? What was the chief complaint? And how many times have we responded where grandma or grandpa or the crazy homeless guy that we always run into has a litany of complaints? You're like, but what is the complaint today? Why did you call 911 today? Just give me an answer, right? What is the primary complaint? Why did you call for an ambulance? Mental status. Patient is alert and oriented to person, place, but disoriented to time and situation, right? As Doug was saying, the EPCR is actually two reports, right? Your data aspect of it and your narrative aspect of it. The data collects data points, the narrative tells the story. However, those two sides have to match, right? Those two sides have to complement each other. If there's differences within there, as in patients, alert and oriented times 3, but the GCS is 14, giant red flag. And what does a red flag mean? If you're inconsistent with your patient care or you're inconsistent with your EPCR, you're inconsistent with your patient care, right? You have the opportunity to tell the story right. So tell it right? Airway, breathing, circulation, all stuff that we know from EMT school, including the D's, which is disability, and E, environment. F is for feet. I'm from Chicago. If you had feet and everything else above it was good, let's go. Circulation, normal, strong, regular. Remember, the idea of the data points is to collect the general information. The idea of the narrative is to extrapolate on that information. So, yes, the patient was alert and responsive, and they were breathing. How were they breathing? Or the patient had a weak pulse. Can you describe it? It gives you the opportunity to lay some color to the data points that you collected above. Rapid trauma assessments, DCAP, BTLS, right? We love acronyms in EMS. Always love acronyms. We'll make an acronym out of anything. Deformities, contusions, abrasions. When we talk about the professional aspect of it inside of EMS, it's important to recognize that, yes, we do love acronyms. Medically accepted acronyms. Not CATS, cut all the shit, or GAW, whatever. Medically approved acronyms, like DCAP, BTLS. In the documentation, you want to identify and document based on not just chronology, but the body, right? Get back to your basics in terms of the regions of the body. Head, face, neck, chest, abdomen, right? All that is pertinent to the current complaint or anything unusual that you find in your assessment. And again, when we talk about the documentation piece of it, you can do this in few words. It does not have to be a novel that you're writing, right? The average narrative on a regular ALS call should take you 10 or 15 minutes, right? You don't have to document, everything where it's like huge. You can communicate a lot of information in a very short amount of time if you follow the call chronologically, your thought process chronologically, your documentation chronologically. Trauma, mechanism of injury, falls. How far they fall? They fall out of bed, they fall over, they fall off the chair. Vehicle crashes. Vehicle crashes are a good one because we tend to miss out on a lot of things in documentation. Estimated speed, airbag use, vehicle intrusion, windshield intact. Was there anybody else in the vehicle that was severely injured or killed? Was there anybody else in the incident that was severely injured or killed? All of these paint that picture, that Bob Ross Happy Trees picture, of how bad the accident was, because the reader needs to understand what you saw. Medications and allergies, baseline vitals and review of body systems. Medications and allergies are my favorite because I love going to patients' house. Do you have any medical problems? Nope. Do you have any medications? Here's a roll, right? I thought you didn't have any medical problems. Well, I don't because I take this. Do you have high blood pressure? No, I take lisinopril. All right. Medications and allergies are one that we tend to skip over a lot because you see these long medication lists and you're like, I don't have time, I don't have the effort. Remember, incomplete documentation is what? Incomplete care. Your sample history, signs and symptoms, allergies, medications, pertinent past history, last oral intake, should I prepare for you to puke or not? And events that lead up to the illness or injury. When we talk about documentation skills, we're talking about taking all of those patient assessment aspects of it that we learned in EMT school and putting it together in a format that is easy to write, easy to read, and easy to follow. And the idea behind the storytelling aspect of it is this is a skill. You can tell better stories. The idea is to create a repetitive process that you use as a guideline in your head, a guideline in your templates, so that the stories that you tell remain consistent. Prior illnesses or injuries, surgeries, hospitalizations. Documenting pain. Pain is I have a soapbox on pain, right? Pain is the most common thing that we are called for in EMS. It is the most common complaint that is filed in any EPCR. It is also the easiest thing that we can fix when it comes to pain. EMS has a bad habit of kind of ignoring the pain, especially from the chronic aspect of things. Your sickle cell patients, your diverticulitis patients, your colitis patients, your chronic back pain, right? There is a such thing as breakthrough pain, right? A lot of times we see these documents come through, these EPCRs, patient called for pain again, just chronic condition, blah, blah, blah. It is one thing to live with a painful condition. It is another thing to have breakthrough pain in which the pain becomes so intolerable and so above and beyond what you normally experience that you need assistance. And that is a true medical emergency. Medicine defines it as an emergency, CMS defines it as an emergency. It is something that should be taken seriously, and it's something that should be documented as well. If you define patients in pain, what does that mean? I've been in EMS for 27 years. I live in pain. My knees hurt, my back hurts, everything hurts, right? It's what we do. We break our bodies to save others. But what does that pain actually entail? And what is their pain they're experiencing now? Also remember, when we talk about the EPCR, again, two of them, one data, one story. Pain is a vital sign. Just like respiratory rate, just like blood pressure, just like heart rate, right? It is a vital sign. If you mark the patient has pain and give them a score in the data side, but don't elaborate it on the narrative side, it's inconsistent documentation. It's a giant red flag for QA and QI. If you don't document a pain score, in the data side, but then document that the patient had pain in the narrative, that's also a red flag. It's inconsistency. So not only do we need to address the pain aspect of it a little bit better in EMS, but we also need to give it some color. And we also need to understand that pain, although subjective to the patient, we need to approach it in an objective manner. OPQRST, right? Onset, provocation, quality, region of radiation, severity, and time. That is a very long narrative. The idea behind OPQRST is that, again, when we talk about DRAT, because we love talking in acronyms, the idea is chronology. And once you get to a piece of the assessment for the patient that includes the sample, or that includes the OPQRST if you're in pain, or includes DCAT, BTLS, these are all tools to help you structure your story. So, onset. Patient reports chest pain, which began approximately 5:45 today. Patient lying in bed when pain began and was not physically active. Okay, well, this is not traumatic pain, right? Patient states pain is not affected by movement and there's no position that makes it better or worse. Okay, probably not orthopedic. Definitely something going on there. Q, patient describes pain as achy and hot. All right, that's not good. R, patient reports the pain is located in the center of the chest, approximately 2 inches below the nipple line, and does not radiate. All right, now we're getting somewhere. Rates pain on a 1 to 10, rates at a 6 at a 1 to 10 scale. If you're going to give pain a rating, make sure you put the scale. We always use 1 to 10. If you want to use something different, whatever. Pain assessment for childbearing women, is this pain better or worse than childbirth, right? That is a good measure for pain management for your female patients. Patient reports the pain was intermittent for the first hour and then became constant, right? That is not a whole lot of words. That gives you a ton of information. A ton for the reader to take back and go, I believe I've got a good picture of what that patient actually looked like. So you were dispatched to the call, you responded, you arrived, you assessed. Now what are you going to do for the patient? Your treatment, right? Your clinical interventions provide the patient with another key component of the clinical narrative. What are you going to do for those patients? 5 parts to this piece of the puzzle, right? The clinical indications, identity, description, time, and reassessment. So, what did you do? Who did it? How did it go? What time did you do it? And what was the result, right? It is understood that times undocumented on the PCRs are not precisely calibrated. So this came up this morning about time issues, right? So how do we manage time issues if dispatch times are inaccurate? How do we manage times if the monitor for the fire department is different from the monitor from the transporting aspect of it, right? We have all of those discrepancies of times, and the stupid PCR won't let you close it until you match those up and make those stop being read, right? So what do you do when all those times don't match out? You should always be tracking your own times. And the story that we tell people is the monitor will never be on trial. The monitor will never be called in for QA, QI. You will. So if your times are off, fix your times, note it in your narrative. Times adjusted for accuracy. Easy. Time adjusted for accuracy. 4 words. You have now solved your time problem, right? Understanding that radio calls will be misheard, monitor times won't match up accordingly. It is important to understand that you are the one telling the story and you are the one that's going to be accountable for those times. Why did you do it? Because I always do it. We always put patients on oxygen, right? I'm from that old school. Everybody got a nasal cannula. We Oprah nasal cannulas. You get a nasal cannula. You get a nasal cannula. We don't need to do that anymore, right? Who did it? Meaning, who was the provider that did it? And that is an important piece, and we'll get there. Why did you do it? When did you do it? And how did it go? Due to the patient's ashen appearance, shortness of breath, and SpO2 of 90% of room air, EMT Jones start a patient on oxygen at 6 liters via simple mask, right? Why did we do it? Who did it? Now, who did it is important because there's 2 people on an ambulance. And always assess, the team is always assessed as 2, right? So the question comes up all the time. Well, my partner, you were there too, right? The same goes for when we talk to ambulance crews like, why do I got to sign this report? I was just a driver. Well, technically, ambulance services is a transport benefit, so you were the one who actually provided care. Yeah, you both go. The other piece of it is to verify and validate the level of skill, making sure that the right person performed the right skill at the right time, right? You should not have an ALS skill being performed by a BLS provider. Does it happen? Yes. Is it documentation issues? Probably. Because I get too fast at clicking the touch screen, it happens all the time. What did you do? Whether it's a medication or in this case oxygen. When did you do it? And how did it go? Right? That assessment aspect of it. And the idea behind DRAT is the understanding that when we go into a scene, it is very rarely all done incrementally. I get there, I assess patient, I move patient, right? A lot of times we'll get there and the patient's between the triangle of death, right? The tub, the toilet, and the sink, right? Can't get them out. Document that. However you run the call, document the call. The idea is to do it chronologically because that's how we tell stories. We tell stories chronologically. We do things chronologically. If you do an assessment afterwards, nobody's going to fault you for it, right? You had to move the patient out of the triangle in order to get an assessment, document that, right? IV, because patient reported pain from an open fracture of the right tib fib as a 9 out of 10 with no relief from immobilization, paramedic Smith administered 2 milligrams of morphine. There's your why. He's got pain, we've got a fracture. Who did it? ALS skill, ALS provider. What did we do? Medication and the dose, right? And how we gave it as well, right? We have a number of medications. You can give a number of different ways. When did we do it? And how did it go? So, per protocol, never ever in the history of ever put this in your run reports. Because what does that mean? The person reading it doesn't know your protocol. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Are you sure you know that protocol 100%? And if it goes to somebody outside of your agency for review, do they know your protocol? Avoid this term, right? Use clear English to describe the assessment that you do and the treatment that you provide. Medication, number of doses, precise dosage. Remember, most of our medications are weight-based now. It's important that you put in what the patient's weight in kilos is if you are going to be adjusting the medication level per mgs per kilo. Right? Routes of administration for each medication and the specific medications or solutions administered. Even the IV aspect of it. Started an IV of what? Saline, 0.9, Ringers, D5W, D10. And the transport. Understand, you have a little bit of a benefit here in this area where you have a number of centers that can handle pretty much everything. When you get outside of the rural area and more of the suburban area, and the rural area, outside of the urban area, I should say, there are certain hospitals with certain specifications of patients that they can handle. There are certain hospitals, I operate just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. There's one hospital that can handle neurointervention. And that's where all of our major strokes go. There are 2 hospitals that can handle trauma, right? So they go there. There's 5 hospitals that can handle a broken wrist or a simple lac, right? Make your destination determination known as to why you are transporting that patient to that specific hospital. The patient says, well, I always go, my doctor's here at this particular hospital. I understand that, but the medical condition you're having, that hospital is not prepared to handle that. We need to go to this hospital. Or patient requested this hospital, patient condition warranted transport or allowed for transport to that facility. How did you transport the patient? Did you transport them lights and sirens? Without lights and sirens? Did you transport with another provider? Did you transport with family members? Did you transport them securely, right? And was there any changes while you got there? The idea behind this, again, is just storytelling. If there's one thing that medics do very, very well, is we tell war stories, right? We tell war stories all the time. And then you got the one guy who's a topper, right? He's done it more than you twice, underwater and on fire. The idea is to take that ability that we have for storytelling and put it in written word, because this is our opportunity to define who we are as caregivers, to who we are as clinicians, and the quality of care that we provide. Because this is the measure in which we are being judged against, right? If you didn't write it, you didn't do it. Remember that from EMT school? You didn't write it, you didn't do it. It's more litigious now, and if you didn't write it, you're a crappy clinician, right? Are you? No. But that's the perception, and that's how you're being measured. Questions, comments? Yes?
Doc, if you don't mind, if we could slide back to pain management a little bit. And I know this is a documentation class, but
Yeah.
Recent discussion in the firehouse about patients that you feel are showing a lot of evidence of drug seeking, right? They're looking for narcotics. And what you're, in your experience, what maybe some of the legal or ethical even ramification that might come from withholding pain medications from your suspected drug
Yes.
seeker? Or
So the question was, how do we handle those that are seeking, that you really don't buy their story? A good assessment, right? One thing paramedics are really, really good at, we can walk into a room and go, sick, not sick, right? That's what we do. You can tell when somebody's in pain. They look like they're in pain. They have injuries that warrant they're in pain. Even the medical pain that we get with diverticulitis or things like that, they are writhing, they are guarded, they are all of those things that you can use as descriptors, like guarding, fetal position, protecting their limb, or, all of those things come as an assessment. You treat your patient. If your patient doesn't look sick, you assess them anyway and make sure, right? If they look like they're in pain, they probably are in pain. If they don't look like they're in pain, how far are you from the hospital? Right? What if they are a seeker? What happens? Doc, what happens?
No, people that are in chronic pain, if usually we've identified them over a period of time as having a chronic pain issue, and we put them on care plans to basically say, this is what you get when you come to the ER. We'll evaluate you, but there's no guarantee of any particular narcotic prescription or anything else.
Red flag for pain seekers is, I can't go to this hospital. Red flag. You can't go.
my theory is, it's not my job to fix their addiction.
It isn't. It's not your job to fix their addiction, nor is it your job to judge them. If your patient looks legitimately in pain, then take care of your patient. Before we are anything, we are patient advocates. And that's what we need to kind of get back to, is that we are clinicians, we do diagnose, and we are advocates. And before we do anything, we advocate for our patients.
Before we break, can I just add to that? So I think, again, whether we treat or don't treat, whether we do an intervention or not do an intervention, I agree with Shannon on our intuition and our ability to spot patients who are in need and those who may not be. But the assessment and the documentation of that are foundational, whether it's a decision to intervene or treat or a decision not to, right? And we do that, again, objectively and factually. I wouldn't go into, interviewed patient, raised concern about drug-seeking behavior. I would say that patient complained of pain, however, exhibits no signs of discomfort. Patient is not sweating. Patient does not have any, outward signs of
Not tachycardic, not tachypnic.
not guarding. No, vital signs within normal limits. Upon consultation with patient, determined that appropriate course of action was to transport, and patient can follow up with physician, right? So that way, if we do it in a foundational way, what we're doing is we're not saying, I think this patient is misrepresenting their symptoms and is seeking narcotics. What we're saying is we did a foundational assessment that supports our determination and our decision not to provide analgesia or whatever it is at that time. And we don't do that defensively or judgmentally. We do it factually. And then it's like we've assessed, and then we've got the foundation laid for the decision whether to treat or whether to transport BLS or whatever that may be, because foundationally we laid the groundwork for that in the assessment in the PCR.
And the other piece of it is, one of the things we've done in the past is, there becomes the ethical question, right? You get the ones that the paramedics are like, but they have pain, I don't really know, I don't want to be the one to make that judge. All pain medication doesn't have to be narcotic. Ibuprofen is non-narcotic. Toradol is non-narcotic. So, I mean, there are other solutions. Ice packs are non-narcotic. All things to manage pain, points of position are non-narcotic. So when we talk about the pain management aspect of it, it's important to understand that we don't just isolate it to narcotics.
Was there a question here? And then we'll take this one, and then we're going to go ahead and take a break.
We get a lot of the same kind of situation, but with homeless people complaining of chest pain, just looking for a warm place to stay.
Yeah.
And then, we'll get the question asked from our QA/QI, hey, the patient complained of chest pain, but you didn't give them aspirin, you didn't give them nitro, what's up with that? So, I mean, how's it, I guess, other than saying, well, they were homeless and they had no physical, there was nothing wrong with their EKG, their vitals were normal limits, there was nothing, there's nothing indicating that they were having a cardiac issue. Should we still be okay with aspirin, nitro?
Well, I think the primary rule is, right, primum non sera, first do no harm. If you assess your patient and you document that you've assessed your patient, EKG is normal, all the vitals are good, they're not pale, they're not diaphoretic, they're not tachypnic, tachycardic, none of that. It's important that if you do give them those medications, who knows what could happen. So I think there's always going to be those automatic flags that come up, and I know exactly what you're talking about because every chest pain gets flagged from the QA/QI, right? Well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? It was called for chest pain. That was the initial dispatch, right? When I got there, the patient complained of chest pain. However, upon assessment, there was no chest pain that we could see or no reason or vital signs or clinical indications to indicate that the patient was having anything that required MONA, nitro, aspirin, morphine, or anything like that. And that's probably a conversation that you have to have with your QA/QI person. But I think those are the ones that you over-document a little bit, make sure that they're in depth, because they're going to get automatically flagged. And we have the same issue. Like, with high homeless population, it gets cold, everyone has chest pain. Well, this QA/QI is not going to have all of this, so we just need to be very clear in the narrative that there would nothing indicate cardiac medication procedures.
Last thing I'll say before we break is this is why a lot of systems are looking at linkages with social services, MIH, community paramedicine, non-transport, treatment in place, telehealth, right? Because, no secret that we have a lot of 911 utilization for things that aren't acute care emergencies and that don't require transport to an emergency department. And that's more of a system issue than, okay, that's fine, Doug, but what do I do when this guy's right here in front of me saying he has chest pain? And that becomes a stickier issue. I would always remember online medical control and consult. But, I think it also brings up questions of just issues of implicit bias. And I don't mean that in a negative way. We all have those biases. But, are we perceiving a homeless person in a certain way? Are we, just to make sure that we would treat this patient the same as if they were in the mansion on the hill and saying they had chest pain and there was no evidence of that, right? So in a clinically consistent and appropriate way. But with that, let's go ahead and take, let's take till 2:30, take a short break. We'll come back and we'll jump into what generally spurs a little bit more question and dialogue, and that is informed consent, refusals, etc. Okay, folks, we are going to go ahead and get started again here and transition into a section we call collaborative informed decision making in EMS. And, we call that beyond patient refusals because largely, and I don't mean just here, I mean really nationally when we've talked about this subject and in our own experience as providers as well, the whole issue of this issue really seemed to be kind of binary. Consent, refuse, right? And, accordingly, I don't think we look at this issue of patient decision-making with quite enough nuance. So we developed a way to teach this to try to move our mindset a little bit beyond just this idea of patient consent and refusals of care and talk about it in a way that we frame as collaborative informed decision-making. And it's something that's aspirational, right, that we should strive for. Not every case or call will allow this to happen, but we want to talk about this as a principle, and then documenting that in a thorough narrative. Now, this idea of collaborative informed decision-making, it's really a process by which the patient, if they're competent, or their legal decision maker, if they're not, and the EMS practitioners discuss the risks, the benefits, and the alternatives of the clinical decisions throughout the EMS interaction. Treatment, transport, destination, right? And they make fully informed decisions about all aspects of that care. And then all of that is documented in a thorough narrative. That is the ideal collaborative informed decision-making process, okay? And the heart of that is obtaining informed consent. And that means we got to look at two fundamental questions. What is informed consent and who can give it to us? So informed consent is permission, it's authorization, given to us to treat and transport a patient. If the patient has legal and mental capacity, we get that permission from them. If they do not have legal and mental capacity, we get it from someone else, a responsible decision maker acting on the patient's behalf. Now, if that patient does have legal and mental capacity, two terms which I'll define in a moment, the patient is our decision maker. If the patient does not have legal and mental capacity, then a responsible decision maker acting on their behalf gives us that consent or doesn't. And then if neither of those are applicable, we have a patient who lacks capacity and no responsible decision maker, we have the law of implied consent. And that is, if I have an ill or injured patient and the benefits of treatment outweigh the risks, the law of implied consent presumes that the patient would want emergency care. Now, once we identify who can give us consent, that same person can give consent or refuse, right? So whenever we identify who the decision maker is, they can give us the authorization to treat or transport or not give us the authorization to treat or transport. Now, in your protocols, you have policy or protocol 0030, general guidelines on consent. So I refer you to that in the decision-making chart in terms of identifying patients with decisional capacity. But I'm going to talk about some more general concepts to help you apply the protocol in certain situations. Now, legal capacity typically means that a person is of sufficient age. And for the most part, that is 18. Now, that is also dependent on the kind of care. Each state has different exceptions that allow minors, people under 18, to consent for care in certain situations. So it's situationally dependent. Did you ever have a sneeze that you knew was coming, you wish it would just come and get it the hell over with? That's kind of exactly where I am right now. Okay. Now, in Colorado, minors can seek treatment for medical care related, and we have it in bullet format here, right, under state law for certain kinds of care, even if they're under the age of 18. Pregnancy, childbirth, contraception, abortion, STDs, sexual assault treatment, drugs, dependency, etc. Minors 15 or older may seek treatment for mental health without a parent's consent, so if we're called to treat and transport a person in that situation. But remember, if they're seeking treatment for mental health, right, we also have to look at whether they are mentally competent to make those treatment decisions. They would be legally competent because state law gives them that right, but then we have to move on to the second part, which is mental capacity. Now, we've all thrown around the term emancipated minor, right? An emancipated minor is essentially a minor either that a court has decreed is able to make their own decisions. That part is very unusual, right? Or if a person is at least 15 or older, lives on their own, or is married, right, the law treats them as an emancipated minor. Now, notice that it says when an EMT, and that would apply to other healthcare providers or other EMS providers as well, in good faith relies on that minor's consent. So remember, I dropped the R word earlier, reasonableness. If a person gives you information and you have no reason to think that they are lying or misrepresenting or, being untruthful, you can rely on that verbal representation as long as doing so is in good faith. You had no reason to think that they were being inaccurate, right? And that's essentially what that means. Because at the end of the day, it's not like we have proof that they're over 15 or that they're married or whatever it is, right? So when we good faith rely on information that we are given, right, that ability to consent applies. All right, so shifting on to legal capacity. Other than exceptions, basically it's a person of 18 years of age or older who has legal capacity. Now, mental capacity means that a person, to be able to make a healthcare decision, has to have sufficient understanding and memory to comprehend, even in a general way, the nature and purpose of a course of action, consequences, their condition, right? And we start with the presumption that our adult patients do have mental capacity unless our assessment and our documentation of that assessment clearly establish otherwise. And folks, it is important not to confuse mental capacity with level of intelligence. I mean that seriously. I know it sounds a little flippant, right? But people do not have to understand the sophisticated mechanism of how adenosine works or how a drug works or what a treatment does or doesn't do to them physiologically, right? The law does not require that level of understanding to be mentally competent. If it did, very few people would be mentally competent because most lay people do not understand pharmacology and related issues, right? So we do not confuse the concepts of intelligence and mental capacity. If they have mental capacity, they have a legal right to make a stupid decision, right? As long as it doesn't harm others. Now, another point to remember with a mental capacity is that a mental health related diagnosis in the patient's medical history is not the same as having mental incapacity. So if we see Alzheimer's or senile dementia or early onset of some organic brain syndrome or whatever it is, that may be one piece of information about the patient's condition, but the patient at the time and the place that we are caring for them may be entirely lucid and capable of making a decision. The diagnosis is not how a patient loses their right to make decisions. So if they have early onset of Alzheimer's, but at the time we assess them, they are decisional. They are alert and oriented times 4. They answer our questions appropriately. And our assessment is that they have capacity. That diagnosis is a piece of their past medical history, but not controlling of their ability to make healthcare decisions at a time and a place that they have mental capacity. Make sense? All right. If my patient is a minor and lacks legal capacity, here are some people who can consent for them. A parent, whether biological or adoptive, whether custodial or non-custodial. So if I have a minor who lives 100% of the time with dad, but happens to be at the playground with mom, even though mom is not the custodial parent, mom is a parent and can give consent for her minor child. It is only when a court severs parental rights, which is highly unusual, that that parent loses that right. But that's not the same as whether or not they have custody of the minor. Other adult family members. So if, for example, I have a 14-year-old patient and an 18-year-old sibling and no one else is around, right? In good faith, we rely upon that consent, and I have never seen a case go south, he said while knocking wood, in those circumstances. A responsible official of an agency that has temporary custody of that minor. We don't think of sending a minor off to the custody of the government when we put him on a school bus, but that is what we're doing, right? So a responsible official of the school, not the guy who sweeps the floors, but the school nurse, the principal, the coach, if it's after hours at practice, right, can give us that consent. A foster parent, that's actually typically like a county child services agency that contracts with foster parents. They're really, usually in most states, in the custody of the county in those cases. So that foster parent has that right as a temporary government custodian of the minor, right? So those are some examples of people who can consent when our patient is a minor. If the patient is an incapacitated adult who lacks mental capacity, we look for people like a healthcare power of attorney. Sometimes that is called a durable power of attorney. But a POA is a document. It's a document that says, I, being of sound mind, in the event of my mental incapacity, do hereby nominate and appoint Shannon as my attorney in fact to make my healthcare decisions during such period of incapacity. So keep in mind that we don't normally read legal documents on scene and try to determine, right, what's... But if I have a call where Aunt Edna is sitting there in her lazy boy and her son, Charlie, says, I want Mom to go to the hospital, and Aunt Edna is going, I don't want to go to the hospital. And you assess Aunt Edna, and she's alert-oriented to time, place, person, and situation, answers your questions appropriately, and your judgment is capable of making decisions, and Charlie whips out a piece of paper and says, I am her power of attorney. Take her to the hospital. Well, we don't normally read those documents on scene, but if we did, we'd find that it said, in the event of my mental incapacity, Charlie gets to make my decisions. Is Edna mentally incapacitated? No. Therefore, Charlie is just a guy waving around a piece of paper, not a POA, right? Because that authority does not kick in until the principal, the patient, is incapacitated. So if your assessment is that the person is not incapacitated, the POA does not get to call the play. The patient does. Okay? Now, on the other hand, a legal guardian is someone who is appointed by a court after a court determines that person to be incapacitated. And once a court makes that judgment and appoints a guardian, that guardian is the person who makes those decisions. By the way, even if your assessment of the patient reveals them to be alert and oriented and competent, they have lost the right to make those decisions because they have been adjudicated as an incapacitated person. If they want to challenge that, they can go to the court and have the guardianship terminated if they prove to the court that they have capacity. But if they are adjudged to be incapacitated, the guardian makes those decisions. And then adult family members, just like we saw with a minor, 14-year-old kid, 18-year-old sibling. What if I have a 90-year-old patient and a 65-year-old son, right? Again, maybe not the POA or the legal decision maker, but in good faith, that is typically a person whose consent we could rely upon. Okay, let's talk questions. Okay, let's talk about your question.
Yeah, so mental capacity and incapacitated adult, I thought this is a slippery slope, at least for me. I always err on the side of patient advocacy. I feel like what's best for the patient. I've got a 90-year-old mother and father right now, and they make their own decisions, but they're not good decisions because they have maybe undiagnosed dementia, Alzheimer's, what have you. But I feel like we have to rely on what is the best for the patient when there may be
So bring it home. What question?
What's right, what's wrong?
Okay, in 30 seconds or less. So just to repeat that, so.
It's a big deal, man.
Oh, I know, it's a huge deal. Yeah, let me just try to summarize quick and repeat the question for purposes of the recording here. So if I have a patient who can answer some questions appropriately, other questions inappropriately, may have undiagnosed dementia, right, not yet formally established as a medical diagnosis, we have those gray areas, right? And what's the right thing to do? Well, you said something, I won't try to butcher what you said, but you said we don't, as long as we are patient advocates and act in the best interest of the patient. Look, I will tell you that 99% of the time that is the answer, okay? When we're perceived as not acting in the best interest of the patient is when we open ourselves up to liability. And whether there's a police body cam or a bystander with a cell phone or a traffic camera or a business surveillance camera, whatever it is, whenever it picks us up being that patient advocate, right, we're already about 99% of the way home with a jury, if it ever came to that, all right? Now, in those gray areas where I have a patient who can answer some questions, not others, maybe is undiagnosed, nothing in the chart, but has some questions about their capacity, they're getting up there in years. Honestly, this is where provider judgment and acting reasonably come into play. And I said earlier in response to that gentleman's question that if we have a foundational assessment that then supports what we do, if later on a bunch of specialists come in and do cognitive testing and determine that this person has capacity, okay, we turned out to be wrong. But at the time, if my assessment was well documented and stated the clinical findings why I proceeded to treat the patient without express consent, I have never seen an EMS practitioner go down on those facts. You're welcome. It's a good question. All right, so let's talk a little bit about involuntary consent. I know that sounds like one of those oxymorons, you know, those inconsistent terms, right? But there are situations, of course, implied consent and other situations. Let's talk about those. We already sort of mentioned a guardianship situation. If a court has adjudicated a person to be incapacitated, they appoint a guardian. Guardian is legal decision maker. That guardian may consent for care that is objectionable to the patient, right? But the law gives that person the decision-making authority. Now, people in custody, in law enforcement custody, under arrest, in custody, right? So that person, let's just remember, is now no longer free to go where they want, right? If they are truly under arrest. It is important for us to be clear and distinguish situations where a person is in custody or under arrest and merely being detained, and are they free or not free to go. And whenever we interact with law enforcement, if as EMS practitioners, we are unclear about the status of that person, because that directly goes to whether the police can give any orders or instructions to take the person away, right? If they are merely being detained but are not in police custody, the police can give an opinion, but we have to do what we determine is clinically appropriate. If they say they're under arrest, they're going to the hospital, okay, the police can say that, right? But they can't control the care we give, the interventions we administer. The destination is also what's clinically appropriate if it's trauma or whatever that may be, right? So we have to, and if we're not clear about that, take this person to the hospital, do this, do that. Again, we switch into patient advocacy mode. Okay, officer, is this person in custody? Are they under arrest? No, I just want them to go to the hospital. Okay, well, just like any other situation where we assess and determine if the patient has capacity, do they need care, and from where do they need that care, we will make those determinations. Okay? It is not our job to guess about what that person's status may be. It is our job to advocate and be clear so we can then be guided in how appropriately to make those decisions. Does the person have the right to make those decisions, or has it been lost because they are now in custody? Once we know that, we can make our foundational decisions about treatment, transport, etc. Okay?
You brought up detained versus
Yeah.
arrested. Is there a big difference?
Well, yes, there is a big difference, right? Because if a cop says, I want to stop a minute, I want to talk to you, right? I mean, I understand what we've all seen and what has happened, but legally, I can go, no thank you, and keep walking, right? Now, if I am under arrest and formally placed in law enforcement custody, I do not have the right to go, no thank you. I don't have to talk, because we all have that right under the Fifth Amendment, right? But I can be prevented from leaving and going somewhere. So they can restrict my freedom of movement if I am legally under arrest or in custody. If I am being detained for questioning and I'm not in custody, I know it's not easy to do and say, yeah, we're out of here, I'm leaving, goodbye, right? That can escalate a situation too. If it proceeds to the point where I'm in custody, whether law enforcement put me in custody properly or improperly, violated my civil rights or didn't violate my civil rights, from an EMS standpoint, we know who the decision maker is at this point. If not, we have to respect that it is the patient until such time as they are legally in custody. And my only point is, those decisions are not always made correctly by law enforcement, but don't let that fall back on becoming a problem for us. If they're not clear when they're giving us orders to do X or do Y, is this person in custody or not in custody? Okay? So we're going to take them to the hospital because you're telling us to, but every treatment, every intervention, and the destination are going to be clinical judgments on our part. Okay, so in Colorado, we also have people under a mental health hold or commitment who are a danger to themselves or are gravely disabled. Also a basis for involuntary treatment and transport in this state. By the way, I think gravely disabled also brings physical limitations into it, not just mental. But if a person, and I interpret that, this is just me personally, that this physical limitation would have to be such that the person cannot effectively take care of themselves. They cannot meet their own basic needs for survival. And I think that's the standard that this language to me sort of implies. We can assume that a person lacks decision-making capacity where there is a reasonable concern, where a person appears to have a mental illness and as a result is in imminent danger to others or to themselves, or appears to be gravely disabled. So look at the flexibility, if you would, again, that we see that word reasonable that I told you at the very beginning was going to make repeat appearances here this afternoon, right? This does not mean we are held responsible to make the decisions 100% correctly and perfectly. It means with the facts in front of us, we made a reasonable decision based on this, and this, all of these inputs, which, by the way, we documented the hell out of, and we chose to proceed because of those foundational pieces of our assessment, right? The law gives us the grace to be wrong as long as we are reasonable. And I think that is the great comfort we should all take, especially in light of what you guys have all been through here. Now, we should make efforts to obtain consent for transport from the patient. That goes to the patient's dignity, right? Even if the person may have questionable mental capacity, is lethargic, is semi-responsive, right? When we're seen having that dialogue and attempting to obtain that consent and have that collaboration with the patient, we are seen as their advocate, right? And that removes the taint that we're transporting them or treating them or giving a drug or doing anything else for an improper purpose. Because we're seen throughout that interaction as being collaborative and patient-focused, right? Okay, now, when we do have a third party giving consent for whatever reason, we found that the patient is legally or mentally incapacitated. We have one of those responsible decision makers giving consent for the patient. We should document who was that, right? And what was their status or relationship to the patient. Were they that parent, that legal guardian, that POA, that school principal, the school nurse, the football coach, right? Who was that person giving that consent that we reasonably relied upon in that situation? And then how did we obtain consent? Was that third-party decision maker physically present? Was it a kid on the playground and we called their mom at work, right? How did we have that dialogue and that discussion with that responsible decision maker? Okay, let me shift now to the law of implied consent. And I know this is a bit of a hot button here, but let's talk a little bit about it, all right? Implied consent is an exception to the doctrine of informed consent. And implied consent means that if a person is incapable of giving us consent, and we've talked about reasons why, legal capacity, mental capacity, and we cannot practically obtain consent from any responsible decision maker. No parent, no legal guardian, no POA, none of those people are there. And the benefits of treatment outweigh the risks of non-treatment. The law presumes that the patient wants that emergency care, and the law of implied consent kicks in. And by the way, in emergency care, that last bullet, the benefits of emergency care always outweigh the risks of non-treatment. We are not administering elective Botox, right? We are providing emergency care. It is presumed that that is beneficial under the law. So the doctrine of implied consent is a pretty powerful exception, right, to express consent from a patient or a legal decision maker. Now, I know, and I certainly understand a little bit of gun shyness, particularly because one of the charging statutes recently here said administration of a drug without consent. How can that person consent if they're in agitated delirium or whatever the case is, right? Well, guess what? Last time I eyeballed it. I'm gonna actually look at it because I screenshotted the language. There's another provision in that statute that should give you comfort and offers, I think, some protection. And what that said was, for a purpose other than lawful medical therapeutic treatment, a person intentionally causes stupor, unconsciousness, or other physical or mental impairment by administering without his consent a drug, substance, or preparation. For a purpose other than lawful medical or therapeutic treatment, right? The doctrine of implied consent is considered a standard of care in health care. I don't think the issue here was so much consent. I think it was whether or not the drug administered was therapeutically appropriate. In my third-party opinion here, right? My point is that the doctrine of implied consent, when it is an appropriate treatment or intervention, offers the legal protection for all healthcare providers, not just EMS, to administer a necessary treatment or intervention. Let me flip that another way and say this. If I conclude that a person needs a particular treatment or intervention, and that the elements of implied consent are met, right? It is important that the documentation capture why we determined the patient was incapacitated and unable to consent. That includes our mental status assessment, alert and oriented, GCS, vital signs, observations, and no other individual was available to give consent. If I conclude that all of those things are present, there is a need for a treatment or an intervention, the patient lacks capacity, no one else is available or willing to give that consent at the time, if I fail to provide a necessary intervention, simply because the patient couldn't give us consent and we're not doing anything unless they tell us it's okay, that itself could be negligent. Because the standard of care clearly is healthcare providers furnish necessary interventions under the doctrine of implied consent when those interventions are documented to be necessary. Okay? So I think on balance, this idea of implied consent, and I'm telling you from decades, not just one snapshot of experience, that it is probably one of the most powerful tools, defenses, and protections for emergency care providers ever invented. And I just think it's important we remember to continue to view it in that proper context. Questions? Just one or two, because in the interest of time, we're going to keep moving. Go ahead, sir.
So, watching the actual trial, they specifically said that you did not try to obtain consent on a person that does not have decision-making capacity for the protocol. So, if either patient does not meet decision-making capacity
Express consent? No, because if the patient is incapable of giving it, and I would argue, in fact, that that consent would be ineffective. Because if a person doesn't have decision-making capacity, just like if we're trying to sell them a car and we say, yeah, sign this contract, and they're mentally incapacitated, it's not binding. Their decisions are not binding on them. So I would argue that if it is clear through our documentation they are incapacitated, their consent is not effective, whether it's yes, I'll take the treatment, or no, I'll refuse it. If the second part of your question is it then okay to provide the interventions? The answer, in my opinion, is always yes, as long as we are clinically, we have made a clinically appropriate determination that that intervention is the necessary next step. I honestly think that from what I watched, it was more that issue than the consent issue than anything else in this particular case. I think it was an arguable point, but I think that was the point that they used to bring that statute in. That's just my opinion. Other questions?
And isn't the converse of that true if he is clearly indicated that there's a medical indication for an intervention, the patient has implied consent, and yet he chooses not to do that intervention? Is that now negligence?
In my opinion, yes. And that's kind of, you said it much clearer. Let me just repeat. If the converse of that is you clearly have implied consent and the intervention is indicated, and then the practitioner elects not to proceed with the intervention, is that considered negligence? In my opinion, yes, because implied consent is an universally established standard of care. When we have clear clinical justification or need for an intervention, I believe we have a duty to provide it if it's in our standard of care, in our scope of practice, and we have the ability to provide that intervention. If I'm a medic on a BLS truck, right, I may not have it. But if all of those things are true, I believe there is a duty to proceed with the treatment that is clinically appropriate at that time. Okay, so let's now shift back into these phases of an EMS interaction with informed decision making. Treatments and interventions, transport or non-transport, and what destination. All of these along the continuum are clinical decisions, right? So that's why I said it's important to move beyond consent, refuse. It's more nuanced. Some people might accept one treatment but not another, or accept treatment but not transport, or say, don't touch me, but I'll go to the hospital with you. So no treatments, but yes to transport. So this is a more nuanced, collaborative process. So the goal is to make sure that that patient or that responsible decision maker, for every clinically significant step, understands and consents. It does not mean, for example, folks, well, sir, I'd like to take your blood pressure. Is it okay if I unbutton the cuff of your sleeve? Yes. Is it okay if I now roll it up? Yes. Is it okay if I now wrap the BP cuff around your arm? Yes. Whack job, right? So it doesn't mean we go but the clinically significant parts of what we do is where we need to really engage in that collaborative, informed decision-making process. So at treatment, some patients accept all treatment, some refuse all, some take some and not others. Each of those outcomes is within the rights of the patient or the legal decision maker to decide. And by the way, when we're having these conversations with patients, we've talked about the importance of writing charts in clinical terminology. But having the discussion with patients needs to be in plain English. Or it's not informed, right? All we've done is inform them that we know medical terminology. Okay? Sir, we think you have a subdural hematoma, possible tibia fibula fracture. You should come with us to the nearest receiving facility. Right? We haven't really told them anything. Okay? So we don't use terms like this could potentially induce an arrhythmia. Right? We use plain English. You could die. It could damage your heart. We may have to, we think your leg is broken, right? Those kinds of direct, plain English discussions with patients. A couple quick scenarios. Cardiac history, patient with SVT requires adenosine and oxygen. Say yes to the oxygen, but when it comes time to give the drug, they say, no needles, I don't do needles, man. I don't want the adenosine. All right, well, do they really understand the risks of that decision? that decision is probably based on a fear of needles, not what's inside the syringe, right, that could help them. So here we have to understand that they understand that the risk of not having that drug is loss of consciousness, death, etc., and that the benefits are restoring a normal heart rhythm and potentially saving their life. Our PCR needs to document that we had that very discussion with the patient or the responsible decision maker. And if our chart demonstrates that we informed the patient that she needed this drug due to her irregular heart rhythm, told her without it, it could make her lose consciousness, cause damage, or even result in death. Patient responded that she understood completely but did not wish to receive the medication. Now that decision isn't just, she don't like needles, it's we told her all of the risks and consequences of that poor decision. And knowing those risks, she made that decision to refuse the intervention. That is where you get the legal protection in those situations. Okay? Now, same thing with transport. Do they go or not go? Right? That's their decision. In this scenario, I have a patient with a hot abdomen, basically, right? Pulse is up, respirations are up, pressure's down. We think they may have an internal bleed. But they say, I get it, I don't do hospitals, I'm not going, whatever happens, happens. Well, in this case, we described that we told the patient why that was a bad idea, what the risks were, and that we gave them alternatives. Call 911 again, call your doctor, have someone drive you to the hospital, go to urgent care. Here are all these other things that you can do. And then we document that. We told the patient she needed to go to a hospital right away. We think she may have internal bleeding. And then we quoted her. I get it, but I don't do hospitals. I'm not going. Whatever happens, happens. We told the patient all these other alternatives, right? And it is perfectly okay to quote or paraphrase the patient. If you're going to quote, put it in quote marks. Paraphrase is recounting what they said in your words, all right? Either one is fine. It is also helpful to repeat back the decision to be clear and give the patient the opportunity to ask any questions they have of you after they've made that decision, right? And then you document that you afforded them that opportunity. Now, in high-risk situations, right, trauma patient on blood thinners and head injury patients, vitals outside of normal limits, dysrhythmia patients, whatever it is, right? In those cases, we need particularly exacting documentation, which I hope also demonstrates a consult with online medical control, right? Now, by the way, the third piece in that, there was treatment or non-treatment, transport or non-transport, but the third piece, which most of you are non-transport here, is also where to take the patient, right? Now, because you have so many accredited centers in this area, that's not much of an issue, but there's a difference in outcomes between a STEMI center and a community hospital for a STEMI patient, stroke patient, trauma patients, right? So where we take the patient is also a clinically significant decision. I was born at Podunk Community Hospital. That's where I've been going my whole life. That's where I want to go. Okay, but you're having a particular type of heart attack that people there die more often than if they go here, right? So that is also a clinical decision. And if they make that decision without knowing the risks, right, that is just as bad as refusing treatment. So that's the third piece of that. Okay, now let me talk for a few minutes about refusals. Now that we have, I hope, framed the issue of how we think about patient decision making a little bit differently, let's sort of revisit the classic patient refusal, all right? You've got a protocol. I direct you to that. It's protocol 0080. Take a look at that in your protocol book. But I want to emphasize that a lot of EMS practitioners, this is all across the country and for decades, mistakenly believe that their legal protection comes from obtaining a signature on a refusal form. And it is true that refusal forms have the wonderful language that says, I hereby release from liability the EMT, the paramedic, the medical command physician, the ambulance service, the fire department, the mailman, the second cousin of the mailman, anyone I ever met in my whole life, from any and all liability for any ill effects as a result of this decision. Great. So we take comfort in the fact that there's a legal waiver of liability, but I will tell you that courts routinely have thrown out those refusals when there is no evidence that the patient knew the risks of what they were signing. So what I am telling you is the legal protection in refusal situations comes from a thorough narrative, not just from a signature on a refusal document. Okay? I am not anti-signature, but I am pro-narrative. And if I had to choose one, I would take the thorough narrative instead of just the signature. Okay? Now, let me give you an example here of a complete refusal narrative. A lot of words on this slide, but I want to toss out some principles here, all right? We were dispatched for an MVC at 3rd and Main. We found a 28-year-old male standing outside his vehicle talking on the cell phone, exhibited no apparent injuries. After he completed his call, approximately 5 minutes later, we interviewed him, asked him if he was injured. He was conscious, ANO times 4, said he hit his chest on the steering wheel and that it's, quote, a little sore, but the car wasn't going very fast. We asked him if he could check him out and take his vitals, but he said, again quoting, "No way, I have to get to work." We explained to him that hitting the steering wheel with his chest could cause serious internal injuries, internal bleeding, death. We recommended he be transported to the hospital. We offered to call his employer to explain. Patient replied that he understood completely but did not want to go. We explained the risks of refusing care up to and including death from internal bleeding and obtained the signature. Now, that signature is icing on the cake. That narrative is the cake. Because look what we did in that narrative. We demonstrated patient advocacy. We identified his cause of his reluctance. He didn't want to be late we'll call your employer. Right? We didn't sugarcoat it. Well, dude, you're standing here talking to me. I think you're going to be fine, but, well, now we just reframed the risks in his mind because we're providers saying, I think you're going to be okay. We have no basis to make that representation to that patient. What we did here was discharge what I call the duty to terrify. It's your choice. You hit the steering wheel with your chest. People have died from that. You're experiencing some pain. You could have internal bleeding. I think you should go to the hospital. If a patient, after knowing that, says no, and you've documented that, because we don't expect most lay people to think whacking the steering wheel with their chest could kill them. We told them it could. Now if they choose to refuse, they do so accepting those risks. And as you see, we documented the hell out of it. Okay? So ideally, we have that narrative and we have that signature. But again, if I had to pick one, I would take that narrative over that signature every day of the week and twice on Mondays. So the primary focus should not be simply getting that refusal signed and going on our way, right? It's the narrative that really, truly gives us that legal protection. Now, we also have scenarios where we don't find a patient. Could be nobody's there. Could be we found that the person there was not ill or injured and didn't require care. I pretty generally define a patient as anyone who wants or needs care, but you also have a protocol that helps you make the determination whether a person is a patient. Now, in those cases, if they're not a patient, they're not really refusing anything, right? All parties believe that the person doesn't need health care. I think it's best to document that. Your protocol says if they're not a patient, they don't need a PCR. So, if there isn't a PCR, at minimum on your NIFRS report or in some other place, I think that the facts that led you to the determination that the person was not a patient are still important facts. Okay? That be memorialized somewhere to be able to prove that. Now, not all situations permit this full kumbaya, collaborative, informed decision making. Violent patients, hazards to crews, people in custody, etc. But at the end of the day, the majority of patients we can engage in this process with. And again, that is the aspirational goal, to think about this in different terms than just consent and refusals. It is a process of collaborative decision making in all the clinically important things that we do. Treatment, transport, destination. A couple of final thoughts here before I turn it back to Shannon on combative and agitated patients. If we have a patient who is agitated, is combative, It is, again, and I've said this in answering other questions, but it is important to remember that how we proceed is based on a foundational assessment that is well and thoroughly documented. Again, the law gives us the grace to be wrong. It merely requires that we be reasonable. All right? So, what clinical findings objectively support a determination that that patient was combative or agitated? All right? And here is one area where it is particularly important to not be subjective. Okay? And remember that we can receive information in making this determination through multiple sources and inputs. What a bystander tells us, what the patient tells us, what a family member tells us, what a police officer tells us, all get factored in, but coupled with what we see and observe, what we assess. All of those things are inputs, right? We were talking about drug-seeking behavior. I'm not going to proceed on a treatment protocol just because the patient says, I hurt, right? Based that question, we all understand that we use our other sensory inputs to make that determination by putting all the pieces together. The same thing is true when we're given information, for example, by law enforcement. It is one piece of the inputs that we use in clinical decision making. And we document those, all of those inputs, and then that is our foundation for how we choose to proceed clinically, right? What was done or not done because of all those inputs. A thorough and well-documented assessment, as I said, is foundational, and this is particularly true for administering medications and restraining patients.
Thanks.
Yes, sir?
So, how many of you have ever been to an M&M?
A what?
Morbidity and mortality.
Case
M&M.
conference.
Yeah, no, the rapper.
Yeah.
One of the best things I think anyone can attend is an M&M. The idea behind them is that they are there for performance improvement of the system. Everybody is there in a just culture learning environment. So we're going to go through some examples, and these are from AFD. This is not a point your finger assessment. This is not an opportunity to call out anybody. These are just real examples from AFD that we wanted to highlight. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but it's important that you see everything that we've talked about kind of come to fruition in an end product. So, if it sounds familiar, you don't have to say anything, right? Consider this our little M&M here. So, this is really hard to see, but the one thing I want to point out is the vital signs aspect of it. What's missing? Another set, right? It is impossible to identify any patient change with only a single set of vital signs. You cannot determine anything from a single set of vital signs. This is a giant red flag, right? Every patient gets 2 sets of vitals, even if it's transport of 5 minutes. I used to argue this all the time when I was on the street regularly. The damn nursing home's across the street from the hospital. It's going to take me 5 minutes to get the patient in and out. The answer is, well, you take one when you get there and one 5 minutes later, right? Because only then can you make the determination if there was any patient change. Remember, I'm not the one reading the report, I'm the one writing it. The person reading the report is going to assess my patient care based on how I wrote that. And if they see one set of vital signs, giant red flag. Because incomplete documentation is incomplete patient care. 2 sets all the time. SOAP narrative, right? This is a really good documentation. I do want to highlight, read you the pieces that are highlighted. While in back bedroom, an attempt was made to obtain a full set of vitals and was unsuccessful due to frequent non-purposeful movement and resistance to interventions. The patient was given a RAS score of +2. That is insanely good documentation. Because what did they just paint for you? An uncooperative patient, right? Right? Yes? No? The patient then thrashed wildly, kicking her feet, and slipped out of the stair chair safety straps. During the resulting thrashing, 4 providers were kicked by the patient. Really good documentation, right? They have a violent patient. They're giving you very good details. So the person after the fact go, yep, that sounded horrible. Okay, carry on. This one's a traffic accident. This is the whole narrative, by the way. We didn't cut anything out. Does anybody want to take a gander real quick as to what might be missing besides half the report? Patient was alert, screaming in pain. This is a 10-year-old patient from a MVA. Patient was able to follow commands, wasn't responding to questioning. Normal respirations, rate of 16 to 20. Patient had 4 failed IV temps. Light manual traction was applied during transport to alleviate pain. Patient was able to couple questions during transport, but was in obvious pain. Patient transported emergent to Children's by Falk. This is a motor vehicle collision. There's nothing about the condition of the car. Absolutely nothing about the condition of the car, right? Nothing about the other occupants, speed, damage, how did she get the injury, right? This is a significant call with an incomplete assessment. Questions? This is a field pronouncement. There's 2 field pronouncements in here, and both of them are really, really good. Patient's sister on scene reports she came to check on her brother and found him unresponsive, not moving in his bathroom. Patient's sister reports the patient usually texts her every morning and didn't. Patient was found in the bathroom of his apartment, face down, bent over the bathtub, triangle of death, with his head and arms inside. Patient unresponsive, pulseless and apneic. Evidence of dependent lividity noted. Standing order field pronouncement, right? What did they get called for? What did they see? What did they find? This is a field pronouncement, so naturally there's no treatment. But they gave you a good picture, a Bob Ross quality picture, unfortunately not of happy trees, but of sad trees, of this patient dead in their bathroom, right? Questions on this one? Okay, chest pain, inconsistent documentation. Patient states she got up, Fry, lying down, spelling counts, Fry lying down and had severe pain in her chest, right? Patient states she feels like she's being hit by a hammer. Patient sits, it gets worse. This is horrible spelling. While breathing, patient states it gets worse on palp. Patient states when she was in the car accident a week prior when the airbag deployed. Patient states she believes that's what it's from. Patient denies other complaint. States she will have her roommate take her and get evaluated. What do you think? Besides the spelling, right? It's chest pain. It's a female. That should be a giant red flag right off the bat anyway, right? We have higher suspicions with our female patients, specifically with chest pain. Could be that it's from a steering wheel, but that was a week ago. Would that still hurt? Would that still cause her enough pain to be calling an ambulance? Heart rate's 146 over 90. Respiration 16, O2 sats 98. Don't know, not enough information. This one is another field pronouncement. Family on scene states they had seen the patient at 11 a.m. and that she appeared fine and was still in bed when they arrived. Patient's family left, went, and when they returned, found the patient, as stated, an obvious death with locked and cold arms. Extensive patient history. They did a SOAP documentation aspect of it. This is a really good documentation. Essentially, the medic told you a story, right? Painted you a picture. That's, ironically, we're the ones judging these paramedics, right? We're the ones looking at how good of a story they told about how good of care they provided. It's not meant to be punitive, but it is a good example of how we as an agency, we as an industry can do better. This one is concerning a little bit. Was dispatched and responded emergent. All right, dispatched, responded, got that part good. For a male party possibly attempting to hang themselves in the garage. Upon arrival, found a 31-year-old male sitting in the driver's seat of an SUV with the door open. Complaint of suicidal ideations. Patient's wife stated she received a picture of a belt around his neck with the patient with the caption stating, "Hope you have a better life without me." Quotes, patient's exact words, when asked if he was currently wanting to harm himself. Argument with wife in the morning, work too much, take care of kids, stress, patient added, wife wreck is very broken. Pic of patient with belt around neck, hope you have better life without me, prior attempt at 16, stop taking RX 2 years. Is that a person we want to get a refusal on? Do we understand his mental capacity at this particular time? First of all, the report is a little vague. It's a little unclear. There's not a good picture, right? What do you guys see? Danger to himself, right? If you just read that, you would think this patient is a danger to himself. But we don't know the outcome because we didn't document the outcome. So when you look at these reports, when you think about how you're telling your story, it's important to understand that you are not going to be the only one reading it, even though you're the one writing it. And this is the scale. This is the measure of how good we are, right? Of how well our patient care was performed. We can be the greatest clinicians on the planet who know our protocols backwards and forwards. If you're not nice to patients, they hate you, right? You can be the dumbest paramedic on the planet who couldn't start an IV on the broadside of a barn. But if you're nice to patients, they love you, right? How you treat your patients is very important, but also how you documented how you treated those patients is equally important, because this is the only legacy aspect of it that remains after you're done with treating that patient. Shortness of breath, need for second IV. This is great documentation. Once in the ambulance, IV line established with good push and pull, but it was compromised somehow when trying to administer Zofran and fluids and was removed. So neither was given and another line was never able to be established. Okay, right? We know what happened. Something happened with the IV. Couldn't get another one set. We had the medications we were going to give them. Unfortunately, it didn't work out the way we planned. Right? Painted a picture. Do you have any questions about that level of care? No. If they were questioned about substandard care, is it documented? Is it truly substandard? No. It just didn't work out that well. And they documented it. This one's a code. All right? Responded to a medical call prior to our arrival. Crew got notes of CPR in progress. Upon arrival, patient was lying supine on the kitchen floor. RP advised the patient was eating dinner and stopped breathing. Hey CPR was established. I'm not sure what Hey CPR is. CPR was done by multiple healthcare providers per 8HA guidelines. After 30 minutes of CPR and CLS, hospital was called and advised of the situation, termination of resuscitation ordered. Besides the spelling aspect of it, what do you see? What do you see? They were on scene for a long time, right? And that's the only narrative that you got? There was no documentation of changes with medications. There was no documentation of pretty much anything. Do you know that they have an IO? Yeah, because it's in the data, but they didn't document how patent it was or anything like that. They're on scene a long time for 7 sentences. If you were reading that, what would you think? Very little was done. Could have been a great code. I don't know. It probably was. It probably went great. But it wasn't documented well, right? So when we talk about EPCRs and we talk about NIFRs, understand, and we're just going to fly through this because we want to give you an opportunity to have some discussion and go through some questions. The NIFRs aspect of it is a data collection aspect of things. It is important to understand the difference. There should never be any shortcutting, but if you were going to shortcut somewhere, it'd be the NIFRs, not the EPCR, right? The EPCR is the legal document that attaches with the patient. It goes with the patient all the way through their level of care, all the way through their transport. The NIFRs aspect of it collects information. Now, it's very important to understand that it does provide valuable information, especially when you're talking about scenes, especially when you're talking about refusals or no patients. One of the things that Doug talked about is you get on scene of a motor vehicle collision and there's 6 people standing around, but none of them are hurt. Well, it's good to document, especially in the NIFRs, if you don't document in the EPCR, that there were 6 people, not patients, 6 people that you encountered at this car accident, all of which whom denied needing the need for medical treatment, right? So even though there was no patient there, you do have some documentation that there were people that you encountered there. So it's simply more than a no patient. Ideally, you'd want an EPCR to document that you found 6 people, there was nobody hurt, no patient found, end report. But ideally, that's where the NIFRS report comes in. Understand that the NIFRS aspect of it as it transfers over, and one of the things that we talked about too is the times aspect of it, right? What do we do about those inconsistent times? I know we talked about it this morning class, and I think we may have talked about it earlier today, but what I will tell you is a lot of times the NIFRS data, the NIFRS timestamps need to match the EPCR. So if you're changing the EPCR times to match for accuracy, and then that is referring to the NIFRS data as well, you need to document in the NIFRS that you changed it for accuracy, that there were times were inconsistent or the times were inaccurate so that you manually changed it, just so there's documentation aspect of it. It's voluntary, which should tell you something right off the bat. You don't have to report it, but you should report it, right? Reports can track fire department activities, determine unique needs for each department, things like that. It is not the EPCR. And it's important to understand that while both documents need to be completed, the EPCR is going to be your source of truth. Now, if your NIFRS data that you fill out for that medical call is completely different than your EPCR, there's a problem there too, right? The simple thing to put in your NIFRS data, CPCR number, blah, 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 right? Easy as pie. Patient demographic information, everything you need to collect for a data standpoint. If you want more information, see EPCR number XXY. Questions on NIFRS? Yes, no? Questions entirely. This is your opportunity to ask us the questions you've been dying to ask. We'll just skip through a lot of this because you guys know all that. There's a lot of NIFRS stuff in here. So one of the things that has come up, it came up this morning, and I'll kind of kick off the conversation, is what is custody, right? What is the difference between, the way that we worded it this morning, I think, was what's the difference between detained and restrained? And I know that this is a very hot topic, and I know that this is something that everybody is kind of looking at from that standpoint. One of the things that I would suggest to you guys is to understand that it is important to know that it's important to get that information, first of all, from the police officer. It's important to get that information on camera, right? We all talk about the whole body cam issue, and it's only a matter of time, I'm convinced of it, unless Doug says otherwise, that EMS body cameras are coming, right? We kind of bitched before about drive cams when they first came out. They're spies in the ambulance and blah, blah, blah. And then before you knew it, we started to realize that they were actually saving more medics than they were actually burying, right? Normally, they were doing more good than harm. They were getting us out of a lot of jams. I think you're going to see the same thing with patient body cameras. But if you know that everywhere you go and everything you do is going to be videotaped, then use it to your advantage. Be audible. Talk about your patient care. Talk about your concerns on those body cameras to make sure that they get recorded. Documentation of your EPCR is one aspect of it, but act your patient care out. The world is a stage now, and everybody's videotaping it, so you might as well take advantage of it. You know, I'm worried about his respiratory rate, or I'm worried about his level of consciousness. Can we do this? All of those things get documented for video record on those body cameras, and it's important that we understand how to use them to our favor. So if the question becomes, is this patient in custody? Is this patient being detained? Make sure you look right in the camera. Like, is this patient being detained? Right? Questions, comments? Yes?
With the rural fire in general, what are your guys' opinions on the legal aspect of there being 2 patient care reports written for every patient by 2 providers at the same certification level, when there's no written distinction between who is the lead paramedic?
Well, let me first repeat the question.
Yeah.
And the question is, what is our opinion on the fact that there are 2 EMS patient care reports written by 2 providers at the same level of certification or same level of licensure, and then you added something to the very end of that? What did I miss?
Yeah, there's no distinguish who is like a lead paramedic.
Oh, with no clear delineation of who is the lead provider.
For us, it's not written anywhere.
So are you saying that because of that, we have 2 medics on the same crew that each write a PCR?
Yep, I'll be there.
Oh, okay. You're talking about 2 different agencies writing their PCRs. Gotcha. Okay. So legally, I would say that in most cases, and I have not looked at Colorado law on this, but in most states where I have looked at that question, each agency would have its own independent legal responsibility to complete a patient care report for a joint response. That would be a legal requirement on a licensed EMS agency. So quite honestly, I wouldn't think anything of it. I would hate to see glaring inconsistencies. I would expect the normal differences in style, formatting, SOAP chart, whatever, DRAT, how you approach it. But I think one of the other benefits of being, well, let me stop there. Did my answer about each licensed agency having its own requirement to do a chart satisfy your question?
Yeah, I was just curious if there's any like weak areas of that, or are we at an increased risk?
Yeah, so your follow-up was where I was going next. Are we at any risks of that, or were there any increased risks? And where I was going is that even though in a joint response, each agency has its own obligation to document and complete a PCR, I do think it's important that there, again, not be glaring inconsistencies. Now, I'm not saying that on every joint response, ALSFR and a transport agency have to confer and say, what did you say here, and how did you word this, and what were your findings here, and what. But I think, honestly, that underscores the need for objectivity. And earlier when I was saying I think there are some things that are really important and less important, I really do think objectivity and fidelity to the facts are the most important thing, because if we're all using that as our common denominator, how we word it and how we structure it and how we organize it can be different. But the key facts are going to converge on a common narrative. And honestly, I think that's most important. And then throw in what Shannon just said. When those common facts in both PCRs point to a consistent narrative of the case, and it's consistent with what appears in other forms of evidence, whether it's a cell phone bystander camera, a body cam, a traffic cam, a business camera, whatever it is, I think that's when these cases are going to stay a hell of a lot further away from the courtroom, to be quite honest. So I think the more we really channel objectivity and we're not letting static or one account, whether it's a cop or a witness or a bystander, control how we unfolded the case, right? And we all sort of use that as our common denominator. I honestly think that really strengthens everybody's position legally.
We had similar situations before where we did intercepts, or we have had supervisors out there. You ever watch airlines? We take a lot of safety stuff out of the aviation aspect of it. In an aviation issue with commercial aviation, there's a pilot and a co-pilot, right? Usually the co-pilot is the one piloting the plane. If there's an issue, the captain has the right to say, my aircraft. And the repeat back is, my aircraft. We did the same thing with patient care. My patient, or your patient, okay, my patient. And that delineates the handoff of, yes, we're in the middle of this, who's now the lead on this? So if you get on scene and you're the lead, and I come up as the transporting agency, the simple transaction is, I'll take the patient. Okay, you're patient. And that's where you document in your narrative, at that particular time, you handed off care and assisted with, care to whichever paramedic.
Dr. Hill, this might clarify for a lot of AFR, but the question comes up all the time. Where does medical control or the lead medic's responsibility over fall forward? I've heard that it's in contract, it's not in the city policy, but it's in contract that we are the lead, or I have medical control.
So you're asking, the question is, medical control, like where does that come from with Aurora Fire versus Falk? To my knowledge, that is purely a inter-agency understanding of like contractual agreement. It's not in state law. Paramedic is a paramedic, whether no matter what ends you are. And if it's not in charter, then it has to be purely that the contract says that AFR has control, and then the contracting agency provides support services to that. So that's how I've always defined it. That's my understanding.
Yeah, because I looked everyone up and never been able to find it. But.
Yeah, I mean, we are working on with the next iteration of the contract services is to have a PCR that's more integrated and combined so that each agency has their own separate narratives essentially, but there's a handoff, like, you do your portion, hand it off care this time, someone else picks up, runs the chart, but you kind of see each other's narratives, you kind of see each other's documentation platform, there's less inconsistencies that way. It's very hard to navigate two PCRs who have significant factual disparities between the two of them.
And that's a trend in healthcare more broadly, right, with integrated health records and EHR and all that kind of thing. So, I mean, that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
What other questions? These are good.
And, when we transitioned from all that stuff on informed consent and collaborative informed decision making, I didn't pause for questions because we wanted to make sure we got through the other stuff. In the last session, that generated a lot of questions. If there are any remaining questions on any of that, happy to go back and revisit any bells that may have gone off as we were doing that.
You have one in the back?
Yeah, what's your opinion on your partner, no matter what the certification level, being your narrative?
Oh,
Yeah, let me repeat it, and then if you want to go ahead first, that's fine.
Yeah,
What is
yeah.
our opinion on a person with a lower certification reading your narrative and, did you say signing off on it? Yeah, okaying or approving.
I'll give you the medic response, and then he can give you the lawyer response. It's two people on an ambulance crew. It's viewed as two people on an ambulance crew. I may not like my partner. I may not agree with their politics or their particular smell that particular day. But we have an obligation to the patient. So he should be reading. The blind signature aspect of it is a very dangerous mentality. And I was guilty of it in the very beginning. Here, sign this. Okay. I signed all my partners' EPCRs. They signed all of my EPCRs. But then you get called into audit one day and you realize that's what they wrote? Whoa, hang on. So it should be a good practice to read each other's EPCRs because you're both going to be answering for that patient care. And the whole aspect of, well, it wasn't my patient, I'm the paramedic, they were a basic, or I'm just a basic, they were the medic, those don't usually fly in the realm anymore. That's my EMS version of it.
Well, it's a good answer. I wholeheartedly endorse your answer, but I would add that another case from the injustice files is that our firm defended an EMT who was charged administratively by the state, not here, in the East Coast, for not actively resuscitating a patient with a partial brainstem avulsion due to a self-inflicted gunshot wound, non-survivable injury. Patient was lying in the snow, so was lingering and had a few agonal breaths, when a paramedic was also on scene and didn't resuscitate. And the charge in going after the EMT's license was that they have an independent duty of care to the patient. And if the paramedic made the wrong call, that did not relieve the EMT of their obligation to act in accordance with their standard of care. Now, luckily, we defended the EMT and their certification was not revoked, but it was a long road between the point where the state charged that person and where they were exonerated in the case. So I guess my point is that we have in our paramilitary structures in public safety, we are laying health care into that paramilitary structure, right? And we're very attentive to titles, scopes of practice, and levels of certification. But I think it's important to remember as healthcare practitioners, which is what we all are, no matter if we're in the public or private side, we all have duties of care to the patient. And each of us can be held to account for failure to discharge those duties, really regardless of our level of certification. So I feel, to take another page from the airline issue, that like they call it crew resource management. You may have an uber experienced pilot and a less experienced co-pilot, but if he says, you forgot to change the flaps, right? I'm the pilot, don't question me. No, the culture is such that we have that collaborative dialogue. And I think our culture has to allow for that too. EMTs may not have the clinical basis to say, well, that's the wrong med or the wrong dose or this or that, but they can read the protocols too, or say, why didn't we put this guy in a cardiac monitor, right? A layperson could probably say that too. So we do have accountability even between levels of provider, and we've seen cases of alleged failures to discharge that accountability. Would you like to add anything? I mean, you're a medic and a lawyer as well, so welcome any thoughts you have on that. Okay, well, thank you. Sir?
Scope limiting.
Yes.
So if you're a medic and you scope limit to EMT basic, where is that liability? Can you answer where that liability lies?
There isn't one.
There isn't one what?
There isn't. What you mean? If you scope limit, if you're a paramedic and say, I only want to provide service as an EMT.
Well,
Yes.
What do you,
So if I actively
Yeah, the department is giving them that.
of an EMT.
Yes, but what are paramedics? Physician extenders.
so what he's asking about, specifically in Colorado law, the law says your scope of practice is defined by your medical director regardless of your state certification. So you have to be approved to practice at your level. So there is a process you can scope limit yourself, or request to be scope limit, where the doctor says, yes, you're a state paramedic, but you're only approved to be functioning at an EMT level. And I think his question is, what does that do functionally from a liability aspect?
Yeah,
or-
doctor, so some people say that because you still hold that certification, you're still hold to the same standard as a medic, and to the same standard of care that a medic would provide. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah, let me.
If we're only practicing as EMTs, we're only allowed to practice as EMTs, does that change for us?
Yeah, let me give you my sort of lawyer answer, EMS lawyer answer to that. And the question is, if paramedic scope limits to EMT basic, what standard of care or liability are they held to? In my opinion, I think we have to separate knowledge and the performance of skills. I think as somebody goes higher on the clinical food chain, you're held to the standard of care of a person with that knowledge, right? So I could be a cardiothoracic surgeon by the side of the road without an operating room or any equipment, right? I'm a physician, but no standard of care can hold me to crack the chest right there and do internal cardiac massage, right? I think the same analogy is true for a scope-limited paramedic who is functioning as an EMT basic, approved by their employer in that capacity, right? There is clear delineation that that is the job for which they are expected to perform. I think if, let's say, for example, you noticed a physical sign that your paramedic knowledge tells you could mean this, that might mean you turn to the medic and say, I put this guy on a cardiac monitor, I'd consider this, right? But as to whether or not you have the personal responsibility to carry out that treatment, I would say that you do not as a scope-limited paramedic at the basic level. So I'm giving you a very nuanced answer, which is a lawyer way of saying it's all bullshit. But what I'm telling you is that I think we have the levels of knowledge we have, but we're not expected to act in accordance with that. I could be a paramedic who goes to work for a basic EMT transfer service, right? That service isn't accredited to do that, right? So I'm not always expected or legally required to do the things that that training and education allow me to do. I could be a lawyer who decides not to practice. Doesn't mean I have to write your will. You know what I mean? So I think we're not what we do as in our employment is based on the understanding between us and our employer, what my job is, what my duties are, what my title is, and all of those things.
What about
But you have the knowledge.
What about the consistencies of how you present yourself? I'm just curious because
I wouldn't wear a patch.
That's what I was getting at. That's
Yeah.
we required if they scope limited, then they scope limited the uniform down so they weren't representing themselves.
Yeah,
as
you
such.
in most states you can't represent a level of service beyond that which you're capable of providing. So I certainly wouldn't have a name badge or a patch that holds myself out. Pardon me?
Stolen valor.
No.
If you are not functioning at that level, the state says you cannot wear a patch indicating you are that, if you're not that.
How do you explain that to a jury that doesn't understand the difference of me holding a certificate versus a doctor saying that I scope limited?
Yeah, I would try to explain it along the lines of what I just did, but hopefully more understandable. Because again, what my license is and what my job is, I could be a licensed paramedic who works at a ice cream shop, right? I mean, I'm not there in a capacity as a paramedic. I have the knowledge, but that's not what I'm doing as part of my job. I could be a physician who's, doing something else for a living now, selling insurance. I don't know. I'm just picking shit now. So, but my point is that I think you can explain that duty doesn't necessarily always, the knowledge follows you around, but the duty to act at that level doesn't always follow you around. It's more dependent upon the circumstances in which you're operating.
Who's from Rockford? Okay, so in Illinois, the state of Illinois certified me as a paramedic, right? But I worked for the city under my medical director. If I went to Rockford, I couldn't be a paramedic in Rockford, right? Because that's not where my medical director covers. I work as that physician extender. I am not a paramedic in Rockford, even though the state of Illinois says I am a state certified paramedic. I cannot function at that level based on what that physician has given me authority to do. And I think you explain it in that aspect of it, and you can rightfully do so.
Quick, best band out of Rockford.
Cheap Trick?
Yes. Okay, I think we have time maybe for one more question, if anyone has any lingering, burning questions.
Don't suppose you, heard there was a town hall meeting that you kind of spoke on some of the inconsistency of the trial for our guys.
I did.
Would you be willing to lay out some of the general principles of what you saw that were not correct, that went incorrectly, or, just for
Yeah, the question was, we did this town hall on the trial here, and would I be willing to lay out some principles on what I saw? I mean, I'll say what I've said publicly. I think the criminal prosecution was inappropriate. I think there may have been evidence of civil negligence, right? And I mean in the strict sense of a deviation from medical standards of care. I think it was highly unusual to use criminal statutes for deviations in clinical standards of care. But I would also remind practitioners on the other side of that everybody's, well, there was no intent, right? There wasn't. But remember, the statutes that deal with criminal negligence, right, and reckless manslaughter, recklessness, negligence, those are essentially civil terms. In fact, in this case, the judge used the definitions from the civil law in the jury instructions, right? So we saw a substantial blurring of the lines between civil and criminal here in Aurora. And, you know, that made it pretty unprecedented in EMS, not in healthcare, because there were nurses and others charged similarly.
Vanderbilt.
In Vanderbilt, yeah, and other places. So, I mean, I think the criminal charges were an overreach. I think they sent a bad message. I'm not saying that's to deny justice for the victim's family. I'm saying simply that I think deviations from clinical standards of care are what we call malpractice, and I think they should be treated as such. That said, I mean, I think, you know, there were serious questions about care. I think there were some strategic blunders in the trial, both directions that I 20/20 hindsight, man. If I was sitting at the counsel table, I might have done the same thing and made similar tactical errors. But you know, I think I'll tell you my main takeaway, and that is that, you know, for years I think everybody in public safety sat back and watched law enforcement attract the scrutiny in excessive force cases and other cases of wrongful arrest and whatever it was. I think, you know, we are now at that same table in the conversation about social justice, in the political crossfire of cases like that. And, you know, whether we like that or not, we operate in that same environment. We operate in an environment of video cameras. We operate in an environment of public accountability. And I think, you know, if nothing else, that clear message has come out of the trial that we view ourselves a certain way. We were talking about this earlier. We view protocols as, you know, they're not statutes, they're not regulations, they're guidelines. Well, we saw what effect the protocols had in the trial and how literally they were followed, right? So the things that we think about what govern us can be very different than what a jury holds us accountable for and what a prosecutor sees as our failings. Sounds like I'm filibustering, but those are just some random thoughts, I guess,
But I would say,
as I
too,
saw the trial.
I don't think it's the end of EMS. I don't think it's, you know, the end of the world. I mean, there was a lot of people. I mean, I have a lot of friends that are like, I'm out, I'm done, I'm throwing in the towel. It's okay to have that emotional response, but at the same time, it's not the end. You know what I mean? I mean, this is the greatest profession you can have.
It's not the end, but the liability is certainly.
It is.
It's a game changer.
It is a game changer, but I think in hindsight we'll look back and see that this makes us better.
And as a quick final thought, you know, this department and this community is embracing the lessons to be learned, right? That is critical. And, you know, we've done the town hall and stuff, and, you know, because there's so much interest in this case nationally. I hate that you good folks have to be the subject of that intense national scrutiny. But, you know, the whole profession is learning a lot from this too, and embracing the lessons that come out of it. And, you know, I think Shannon said what I think is the bottom line, and that is that much of what we do is performative now. And I'm not saying that means we give quality patient care second place, but how we're seen when we're delivering that care, and if it's always in service of advocacy to the patient, and it can't be seen as anything else, I think that is probably the key lesson that comes out of it.
You know, we would love to have hope that our two fellow members, that something might change because of some of the mistakes that may have been made or something. Is there any hope for us to hold on to that they have a case to change their outcome, the outcome of the trial as it still stands now.
Do they have grounds for appeal?
Yeah.
I think they do, but I haven't really looked at the appellate issues, but I think there are some. I do. I'm concerned about, the sentencing coming up because of what happened with the police officer who was convicted on a lesser count of assault. And, some of the things that the judge said during trial, which were well within his right to say, I think give us a preview of how he's going to treat sentencing in a few weeks. But I think there are grounds. I haven't consulted with defense counsel, so I'm not sure what they may be working up. Some of you folks may have a better idea of that than I do. But I would say that I hope, and I don't know your colleagues who were involved in that case, but I do hope that the building that AFR has done in trying to glean the important lessons of that, to improve the ways that it does things, to educate, to do all the things like we're doing right now, I hope that continues. And if those two individuals particularly choose to play a part in that and helping to educate providers across the country to learn those same lessons, this is new ground. We have not seen a case like this. And, it's a cautionary tale for other practitioners, that's to be sure. But it is the world in which we now find ourselves, and that's the tragic part. And again, there's an individual who is dead, and there's the need for justice and accountability for him and his family. I feel that accountability could come civilly and through other ways. I see other failings and other parts of the public safety response. I won't say too much more about that, but I think there's lessons like that can be turned into a positive for the whole profession. If I can try to end it on an up note. So let me thank you all for your questions, and let me turn it over to Commander Hayes and Dr. Hill for any wrap-up remarks.
I think Doug said it best when he started, that the brain can only leave the door,
But can endure, yeah.
but can endure. It's a long day, I realize that. I think particularly the way we finished up highlights the fact that there is a lot of issues that are still very hot topics, not just in-house, but in the whole area. There's a lot on our minds. We have found opportunities and things we think we can improve on. And I think that's something we have been doing, trying to find how can we do a better job. All of you are here for the same reason I joined in the service, was to help others and to do a good job. And I think a lot of the information that's here is stuff that can really help us. I can't remember the last time we had a sit-down lecture like this on documentation. It's been a long time. And as you all know, particularly with AFR, we have a very young department. I'm sure a lot of you have a fairly young department too. And some of these people are hearing these things for the very first time. So I do appreciate the patience. I appreciate you coming out, spending time to listen to these guys. As I said at the beginning, they are the experts, and I'm super appreciative for them being here. And thank you very much for your questions. With that, I'll turn over to Dr. Hill. We'll close this out.
So just, closing thoughts, one of the values of having this done by, legal professionals is really to look at the lens of how we're documenting things, okay? It's not just so when I'm reading a PCR, I don't look at it just in the sense of medically what do we do, but I also look at, is this chart defensible, okay? If you're sued, is it defensible? Does it explain what happened? Does it explain what you did or did not do? And that is an area that you can always improve upon. I can improve upon it. I always try to make sure that my documentation is supportive, that on a chart when years later it might come up in a civil suit or something, is that I'm not going to have firsthand recollection of that patient, but does my chart stand by itself, okay? And if it doesn't, okay, some of the examples you saw, some of the examples you could say this is totally defensible. Some examples is you're going to say, I don't know anything about this patient, and that chart doesn't explain anything to me either. So you're going to have a hard time on the stand explaining that chart in a lawsuit or anything else. And that's my point, is to say, document in a way that it stands by itself, that someone who's not there can easily read what you wrote and understand what you did, why you did it, why you didn't do something, why you did do something, and that you can, even later on, 2 years later, you can read your own note and say, I know why I did what I did. For those of you who didn't watch the town hall, it's free. If you go to Prodigy EMS, you can make your own free account and actually watch it for free. It's 90 minutes long, but you can watch the entire podcast on Doug Wolfberg's review of the case.
And I would add, I would really welcome, you can be critical of how we approach the case study of this, for the national audience, but I'd welcome, particularly from this audience, any direct feedback that you have, and I'll be happy to give you my card. And critical or praiseworthy, whatever it is, this group, more than any group nationally, is a group I would welcome input from. So thank you. That's all we have. Yeah, thank you guys and gals.
Thank you.